The Apostolic Age, or the current church history, begins formally around 33 AD, following the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in Jerusalem under Roman prefect Pontius Pilate during the governorship of Judea. The crucifixion is documented as occurring during the governance of Pilate under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, traditionally dated to the period between 30 and 33 AD. Following the death of Jesus, his followers reported his resurrection, which became the foundation for the formation of the earliest Christian communities. The earliest of these communities was concentrated in Jerusalem, consisting primarily of Jewish followers who accepted Jesus as the Messiah, along with a small group of Gentiles who had come under the influence of Jewish monotheistic teachings. The initial structure of the church was modest and decentralized. Leadership was primarily exercised by the 12 apostles, including Peter, James, John, Andrew, and others, each responsible for maintaining community cohesion, teaching, and overseeing religious practices. Peter, traditionally recognized as the principal figure among the apostles, presided over the Jerusalem community. His brother, Andrew, and James, known as the brother of Jesus, held leadership roles, while John became prominent in theological development and community instruction. The earliest followers maintained Jewish practices, attending the temple in Jerusalem while also observing teachings attributed to Jesus, which emphasized monotheism, ethical conduct, and the coming kingdom of God. The first major event marking the organized emergence of the church occurred during Pentecost, shortly after Jesus' crucifixion, commonly dated to 33 AD. Pentecost, a Jewish festival occurring 50 days after Passover, became significant as the point at which the apostles and other followers reportedly gathered in Jerusalem and began to spread their message systematically. Historical accounts suggest that at this time the community rapidly increased in size, partly due to the presence of Jews from the wider Roman Empire in Jerusalem for the festival, facilitating early dissemination of the teachings. The community began to practice communal living, sharing property and resources among members, creating a structured yet informal social and religious network that would serve as the foundation for future expansion. The early missionary activity of the apostles focused primarily on Judea and Galilee. Peter, James, and John led the Jerusalem community while traveling minimally to surrounding towns. The movement gained further momentum with the missionary efforts of Paul, formerly known as Saul of Tarsus. Paul, a Pharisee educated under Gamaliel in Jerusalem, initially opposed the Christian movement and participated in the persecution of its followers. His conversion, traditionally dated to around 34 AD, occurred on the road to Damascus, where he reportedly experienced a vision that led to his immediate adoption of the Christian faith. Following his conversion, Paul became one of the most influential figures in the expansion of Christianity, particularly among Gentiles throughout the Roman Empire. Paul's missionary journeys, conducted between approximately 46 and 64 AD, targeted key urban centers in the Eastern Roman Empire, including Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Rome itself. These cities were hubs of commerce, culture, and communication, allowing Christian teachings to spread efficiently across large populations. Paul established local communities in these cities, appointing elders and deacons to maintain organizational stability and doctrinal consistency. His epistolary writings, including letters to the Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and Romans, addressed theological questions, ethical conduct, and communal governance, forming a foundational corpus for what would later be included in the New Testament. Paul's approach emphasized the universality of the message, advocating that Gentiles were not required to adhere to all aspects of Jewish law, a position that facilitated wider adoption and integration across diverse populations. The Jerusalem church faced external challenges, particularly persecution from Roman authorities and some segments of the Jewish leadership. Historical accounts note that James, the brother of Jesus and head of the Jerusalem community, was executed around 62 AD. Peter and Paul were reportedly martyred in Rome under Emperor Nero's persecution following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, although precise dates vary within a small historical range. These events reflect the early church's precarious position within the Roman political and social framework, where deviations from official religious practice were occasionally punished severely. Despite these persecutions, Christian communities continued to expand, demonstrating organizational resilience and the appeal of their teachings across social classes, from slaves and artisans to members of the urban elite. By the latter half of the first century, the church had become increasingly structured and geographically dispersed. Communities existed not only in Judea and Galilee, but also in Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and along the eastern Mediterranean coastline. The epistles of Paul, Peter, James, and John were circulated among these communities, providing doctrinal guidance, ethical instruction, and encouragement in the face of persecution. The development of these writings indicates a growing literacy among early Christian groups and a systematic approach to theological dissemination. The texts emphasized ethical behavior, faith in Jesus as the Messiah, and communal responsibility, reinforcing social cohesion and distinct identity from the surrounding Greco-Roman and Jewish populations. During this period, theological debates began to emerge concerning the interpretation of Jesus' teachings and the relationship of Christianity to Judaism. Early controversies included discussions on adherence to Jewish law, circumcision, dietary restrictions, and the observance of festivals. The Council of Jerusalem, dated around 49 to 50 AD, is traditionally cited as a key moment in resolving disputes over Gentile inclusion and the necessity of following Jewish law. The decision allowed Gentile converts to integrate into the Christian community without full compliance with Mosaic law, a move that significantly facilitated the expansion of Christianity into diverse cultural and ethnic contexts across the Roman Empire. The organizational structures established during the Apostolic Age laid the groundwork for subsequent church governance. Local congregations were overseen by elders or bishops, supported by deacons who managed charitable functions and logistics. The apostles maintained doctrinal oversight, ensuring consistency across geographically dispersed communities. Baptism and the Eucharist emerged as central ritual practices, codifying membership and communal identity. These rituals, while varying in form and frequency among communities, provided a shared framework that unified early Christians and distinguished them from other religious groups. Quantitative estimates suggest that by the end of the first century, Christian communities in the Eastern Roman Empire numbered in the tens of thousands. Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and Corinth were among the most significant urban centers with established Christian populations. Social composition included a mix of free citizens, slaves, artisans, and members of the local elite. The spread of Christianity was facilitated by established trade routes, shared language, Koine Greek in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the relatively extensive infrastructure of the Roman Empire, which allowed for travel and communication between communities. The Apostolic Age also saw the development of early liturgy and theological formulation. The letters of Paul and other apostolic writings, along with oral teachings, were used to instruct converts and maintain uniformity in belief and practice. Worship included communal gatherings on designated days, prayers, hymns, and the sharing of meals, reflecting both continuity with Jewish tradition and adaptation to the new faith. The period also witnessed the initial formation of a canon of authoritative texts, though formal recognition of the New Testament would not occur until later centuries. By the close of the first century, the Apostolic Age had firmly established the foundation for a rapidly expanding religious movement. Despite periodic persecution, lack of formal recognition, and internal disputes, the Church had created a network of communities with shared beliefs, practices, and governance. Its growth demonstrated both adaptability and resilience, laying the structural, theological, and social foundations that would enable Christianity to survive subsequent centuries of political, cultural, and religious challenges. The legacy of the Apostolic Age lies in the combination of missionary activity, community organization, theological development, and textual production. The work of Paul, in particular, along with the leadership of Peter, James, and John, provided a framework that would guide Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. The decisions made during this period regarding Gentile inclusion, ritual practice, and organizational structure allowed Christianity to transition from a sect within Judaism to an independent and globally recognizable religious movement. By 100 AD, the Apostolic Age concluded with a church that was established in major urban centers across the Eastern Mediterranean, cohesive in doctrine yet diverse in practice. It had endured persecution, negotiated internal disputes, and developed a recognizable identity distinct from both Jewish tradition and the surrounding Greco-Roman religious environment. The structures, writings, and missionary efforts from this period served as a foundation for subsequent expansion and consolidation, making the Apostolic Age a critical era in the historical development of the Church. Following the deaths of the apostles, the Church entered a period of consolidation and definition between 100 and 312 AD, known as the Ante-Nicene era. This phase marked the transformation of Christianity from a loosely organized network of local congregations into a more structured and self-conscious institution operating across the Roman Empire. The absence of living apostles forced Christian communities to define doctrine, leadership, and orthodoxy through written texts, local councils, and emerging ecclesiastical hierarchies. This was also the period when Christianity grew steadily despite periods of persecution by Roman authorities. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Christian communities were spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, including regions such as Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Greece. By around 150 AD, Christianity had also taken root in Rome and North Africa. The earliest writings of the post-apostolic period came from individuals who personally knew or were influenced by the apostles. Clement of Rome, who wrote around 95 to 99 AD, addressed the church at Corinth, emphasizing unity and obedience to church leaders. His letter illustrates that the Roman Church already held moral and doctrinal authority among other Christian communities. In the early 2nd century, the figure of Ignatius of Antioch, Bishop of Antioch, became central to the development of ecclesiastical structure. arrested and transported to Rome for execution under Emperor Trajan around 107 AD. Ignatius wrote 7 letters to various churches, in which he outlined the importance of the bishop as the spiritual leader of the local congregation, assisted by presbyters and deacons. His emphasis on hierarchical structure, the Eucharist, and unity against heresy reflects the growing institutional identity of the Church. Another important early writer, Polycarp of Smyrna, c. 69 to 155 AD, linked the apostolic generation with the developing church of the 2nd century. Polycarp's correspondence with the Philippians and his martyrdom under the Roman authorities around 155 AD symbolized the endurance of the faith despite persecution. During this period, persecution was not constant but occurred sporadically under certain emperors or local governors. The Roman Empire generally tolerated diverse religions, but Christianity was viewed with suspicion due to its refusal to participate in state-sanctioned sacrifices and its secretive gatherings. Christians were accused of atheism, cannibalism, and disloyalty to the emperor, charges that stemmed from a misunderstanding of Christian rituals and exclusivist monotheism. Under Emperor Trajan, 98 to 117 AD, official policy toward Christians was clarified. In a letter exchange with Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia Pontus, Trajan advised that Christians should not be actively hunted, but if accused and refusing to recant, they should be punished. This set a precedent for intermittent, localized persecution. Christianity, despite being illegal, continued to spread throughout the empire. By the mid-2nd century, it had a notable presence in cities like Carthage, Alexandria, and Lyons. Doctrinal and theological development during this period was largely shaped by the need to define orthodoxy against internal heresies and external criticism. Gnosticism, an intellectual and religious movement blending elements of Greek philosophy and Eastern mysticism, emerged as a major challenge. Gnostics claimed secret knowledge of divine truths and often denied the full humanity of Jesus. Church fathers such as Irenaeus of Lyons, c. 130 to 202 AD, wrote extensively against Gnostic teachings. In his work against heresies, Irenaeus defended the unity of Scripture and apostolic tradition, insisting that true teaching was preserved through the succession of bishops originating from the apostles. The 2nd and 3rd centuries also witnessed the expansion of Christian intellectual life. Justin Martyr, c. 100 to 165 AD, a philosopher converted to Christianity, produced the Apologies and Dialogue with Trypho, defending Christian beliefs before Roman audiences. He argued that Christianity was the true philosophy, fulfilling the highest aspirations of reason and morality. Justin was executed during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, part of a broader wave of persecution around 165 AD. Simultaneously, the church's internal structure matured. The threefold order of bishops, presbyters, and deacons became standardized. Bishops presided over local congregations and maintained unity of doctrine through correspondence and synods. By the late 2nd century, certain cities, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, had become prominent centers of ecclesiastical authority. The concept of apostolic succession, tracing the legitimacy of bishops through a line of ordination reaching back to the apostles, was formalized as a means of preserving orthodoxy and excluding heretical movements. The canon of Christian scripture began to take recognizable form during this era. The writings of Paul and the 4 canonical Gospels were already widely circulated by the early 2nd century. By around 180 AD, Irenaeus explicitly recognized four authoritative Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, rejecting alternative accounts as heretical. The Muratorian fragment, dated to the late 2nd century, provides the earliest known list of New Testament books in use by Western churches. Although the precise boundaries of the canon were not yet fixed, a consensus emerged concerning the texts regarded as inspired and authoritative. The 3rd century saw both growth and crisis. Persecutions intensified under certain emperors, particularly Decius, 249 to 251 AD, and Diocletian, 284 to 305 AD. The Decian persecution required all citizens to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and obtain certificates proving compliance. Christians who refused were executed or imprisoned. Those who complied under pressure created internal conflict upon the persecution's end. The Church had to decide whether to readmit those who had lapsed, leading to disputes over penitence and forgiveness. Cyprian of Carthage, d. 258 AD, played a critical role in resolving these issues, emphasizing unity and reconciliation through episcopal authority. He was later martyred under Emperor Valerian. Parallel to persecution, Christianity's intellectual and theological sophistication deepened. Origen of Alexandria, c. 185 to 253 AD, became one of the most influential theologians of the early Church. His writings on biblical interpretation, systematic theology, and the nature of the Logos influenced both Eastern and Western Christianity. Origen advanced allegorical methods of scriptural exegesis and engaged extensively with Greek philosophy, particularly Platonism. His vast literary production, estimated at thousands of works, marked the peak of early Christian scholarship in the Alexandrian tradition. By the late 3rd century, Christianity had spread across all major regions of the Roman Empire. Archaeological and documentary evidence shows communities in Italy, North Africa, Gaul, Britain, and Asia Minor. The Church's demographic base had broadened beyond urban centers to include rural populations, though the term pagan, derived from paganus, country dweller, would later reflect the slower adoption of Christianity in the countryside. Despite persecutions, estimates suggest that by 300 AD, Christians may have comprised between 5 and 10% of the empire's population, perhaps 6 million people within a population of 60 million. Doctrinal controversies continued alongside institutional consolidation. Montanism, a prophetic movement arising in Phrygia in the late 2nd century, challenged episcopal authority by emphasizing direct revelation from the Holy Spirit. Although initially tolerated, it was later condemned for promoting excessive rigor and prophetic excess. Other groups, such as the monarchians and adoptionists, proposed divergent understandings of the relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ, prompting debates on the nature of the Trinity. These controversies stimulated theological precision, leading to early formulations that would later culminate in Nicene orthodoxy. The relationship between Christianity and the Roman state reached its most strained phase under Diocletian, who launched the Great Persecution beginning in 303 AD. Christian scriptures were confiscated, churches destroyed, and clergy imprisoned. The persecution extended across the empire, but varied in intensity by region. It represented the last major attempt by imperial authorities to suppress Christianity. Despite widespread arrests and executions, the movement persisted, sustained by underground networks, secret worship, and the resilience of local communities. Alongside persecution, internal administration grew increasingly formalized. The role of the bishop became both spiritual and administrative. Regional councils were convened to address doctrinal disputes and coordinate responses to persecution. The episcopal sees of Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and later Carthage began to serve as principal centers of communication and leadership. The Bishop of Rome, by virtue of the city's political and historical prestige, held a position of moral authority, though not yet the universal jurisdiction later claimed by the Papacy. Apologetic literature flourished during this era as Christian intellectuals sought to defend their faith against pagan criticism and philosophical skepticism. Writers such as Tertullian of Carthage, c. 160 to 225 AD, introduced Latin theology and coined enduring terms like Trinity. He argued that faith and reason, though distinct, were compatible, and that the moral discipline of Christians surpassed that of pagan society. His phrase, "the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church," encapsulated the resilience of the Christian movement under persecution, though his later association with Montanism reflected ongoing tensions within early theology. By the early 4th century, the Church had developed a comprehensive framework for belief, practice, and governance. Regular liturgical practices, including baptism, the Eucharist, and public readings of Scripture, were standardized across many regions. The use of the fish symbol, ichthyes, and catacomb art demonstrated the emergence of a shared Christian identity distinct from the surrounding culture. Catechumenate instruction prepared converts for baptism through a period of moral and doctrinal formation, reinforcing communal discipline and cohesion. Socially, Christianity appealed to a broad cross-section of society. Women played active roles in charitable work and catechesis, and Christian communities supported widows, orphans, and the poor, setting them apart from the traditional structures of Roman patronage. Slaves and free citizens worshiped together, and the moral rigor of the faith attracted individuals dissatisfied with the perceived decadence of pagan religion. By 312 AD, on the eve of Constantine's conversion, Christianity had become a significant social and religious force within the Roman Empire. It had endured 2 centuries of sporadic persecution, developed a coherent theological tradition, established institutional structures, and defined its canon and rituals. The Church stood ready to transition from a persecuted minority to a recognized and, eventually, dominant religion within the empire. The early 4th century marked a decisive turning point in church history. After nearly 3 centuries of periodic persecution, Christianity transitioned from a marginalized movement to a legally recognized and eventually state-endorsed religion. This transformation, known as the Constantinian shift, fundamentally changed the relationship between church and state, shaping Christian doctrine, ecclesiastical structure, and imperial politics for centuries to come. By 312 AD, the Roman Empire was divided among multiple rulers under the tetrarchic system established by Emperor Diocletian. Civil wars and administrative instability characterized the early 4th century. Among the competing emperors was Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, who governed the western provinces. On the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in October 312 AD against his rival Maxentius, Constantine reportedly experienced a vision or dream associated with the Christian symbol of the cross. Ancient sources such as Lactantius and Eusebius describe that Constantine interpreted this as a divine sign promising victory if he adopted the Christian symbol. The following day, his forces defeated Maxentius near Rome, consolidating his control over the Western Empire. In 313 AD, Constantine and Licinius, emperor of the eastern provinces, issued the Edict of Milan, which granted religious toleration to Christians and restored confiscated property. This decree ended official persecution and established the legal status of Christianity alongside other religions within the empire. For the first time, Christians could worship publicly, build churches, and organize openly. This marked the formal conclusion of the Great Persecution initiated by Diocletian a decade earlier. Constantine's conversion had both religious and political dimensions. While his personal beliefs evolved gradually, his support for Christianity was consistent. He sponsored the construction of major churches, including the original Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, begun around 326 AD. He granted privileges to the clergy, exempting them from certain civic duties and taxes, and he involved himself in ecclesiastical disputes to maintain unity within both church and empire. These policies effectively elevated Christianity to a favored position within Roman society, though paganism continued to exist legally for several more decades. The legalization of Christianity prompted rapid institutional and administrative growth. Bishops, who had previously operated in relative obscurity, now gained public influence. The imperial government recognized episcopal courts for certain civil matters, reflecting a new partnership between church and state. The wealth and social standing of the clergy increased as imperial patronage expanded. At the same time, these changes introduced new challenges, including disputes over doctrine and the nature of ecclesiastical authority. One of the first and most significant theological controversies of this period arose in Alexandria in the early 4th century. A presbyter named Arius, c. 256 to 336 AD, taught that the Son of God was not co-eternal with the Father, but a created being, distinct and subordinate in essence. This doctrine, known as Arianism, spread rapidly and provoked intense opposition from many bishops, particularly Athanasius, a deacon at Alexandria who would later become bishop. The controversy threatened both theological unity and imperial stability, leading Constantine to intervene. In 325 AD, Constantine convened the First Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council in Christian history. It brought together approximately 300 bishops from across the empire, primarily from the eastern provinces. The council sought to define Orthodox belief regarding the relationship between the Father and the Son. The assembled bishops rejected Arius's teaching and adopted the Nicene Creed, which affirmed that the Son was begotten, not made, being of one substance, homoousios, with the Father. The council also established uniformity in the calculation of Easter and issued 20 canons regulating clerical conduct and ecclesiastical administration. Despite the council's decision, Arianism persisted for decades, gaining support among certain imperial factions and regional bishops. Constantine himself later recalled Arius from exile, reflecting the complex intersection of theological conviction and imperial politics. After Constantine died in 337 AD, the empire was divided among his sons, two of whom, Constantius II and Constans, adopted differing stances on the Arian controversy. Constantius favored Arian or semi-Arian positions, leading to renewed conflicts within the church. During this period, the administrative structure of the church became increasingly defined. The major episcopal sees, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, emerged as centers of ecclesiastical authority, a hierarchy that would later form the basis of the patriarchal system. The Bishop of Rome, by virtue of the city's historical prestige and its association with the apostles Peter and Paul, gained increasing influence in doctrinal matters. The term pope, originally used more broadly, began to refer specifically to the Roman bishop. However, the papacy's authority remained moral rather than juridical at this stage, with the Eastern patriarchs maintaining substantial autonomy. Constantine's policies also reshaped the religious landscape of the empire. Paganism remained legal but gradually lost imperial patronage. Temples continued to function, but public funds and honors shifted toward Christian institutions. Constantine retained certain pagan titles, such as Pontifex Maximus, reflecting the transitional nature of the period. His legislation reflected a blend of Christian ethics and traditional Roman governance, including laws promoting Sunday observance, restricting divination, and protecting clergy and the poor. These measures reflected the growing moral influence of Christianity within the imperial administration. In 330 AD, Constantine relocated the imperial capital to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. The new capital, strategically positioned between Europe and Asia, was founded with Christian symbolism and included prominent churches. Constantinople became a major ecclesiastical center, eventually rivaling Rome in influence. The shift of political power eastward reinforced the importance of the Eastern Church and set the stage for future divisions between Eastern and Western Christianity. After Constantine's death, his sons and successors continued to shape the evolving relationship between church and empire. Under Constantius II, 337 to 361 AD, theological disputes intensified, with multiple councils convened to address variations of Arian and Nicene positions. Imperial involvement in theology became a regular feature of church life, as emperors sought to use religion as a tool of political unity. The repeated exile and reinstatement of bishops like Athanasius of Alexandria illustrated the volatility of the period. Athanasius's writings, including on the Incarnation, defended the Nicene position and became foundational for later Trinitarian theology. The brief reign of Julian the Apostate, 361 to 363 AD, represented the last significant attempt to restore paganism as the dominant religion of the empire. Julian, a nephew of Constantine, rejected Christianity and sought to revive traditional Roman cults. He reopened temples, reinstated pagan rituals, and restricted Christians from teaching classical literature. His policies, however, lacked broad support, and his death during the Persian campaign in 363 AD ended the pagan revival. Subsequent emperors reinstated Christianity's privileged position. Under Emperor Jovian, 363 to 364 AD, and later Valentinian I in the west and Valens in the east, imperial favor oscillated between Nicene and Arian factions, depending on the ruler's personal sympathies. Theological divisions continued to shape ecclesiastical politics. Meanwhile, Christian monasticism, which had begun in Egypt during the previous century, expanded significantly during this era. Figures such as Anthony the Great and Pachomius established models for solitary and communal monastic life, emphasizing asceticism, prayer, and withdrawal from worldly affairs. Monasticism spread from Egypt to Syria, Palestine, and eventually to the western provinces, providing new forms of Christian devotion and discipline. The role of women in the church also evolved. Christian widows and virgins organized charitable works, supported clergy, and, in some cases, influenced theological debate through correspondence and patronage. Wealthy Roman matrons such as Marcella and Paula in the later 4th century would later sponsor monastic and biblical scholarship, laying the groundwork for the institutional church of the following era. The final phase of the Constantinian transformation occurred under Emperor Theodosius I, who reigned from 379 to 395 AD. Theodosius, a staunch supporter of Nicene Christianity, ended official tolerance of pagan religions and enforced doctrinal orthodoxy. In 380 AD, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Christianity, specifically the faith defined by the bishops of Rome and Alexandria, as the official religion of the Roman Empire. The edict described followers of the Nicene Creed as Catholic Christians and branded all others as heretics. Pagan sacrifices were banned, and heretical groups faced legal penalties. Theodosius's policies consolidated Christianity's position as the state religion, formalizing the alliance between church and empire. Bishops now wielded substantial civic authority, and the imperial government intervened in ecclesiastical disputes with increasing frequency. The partnership, however, also produced tensions as church leaders asserted moral independence from imperial control. The confrontation between Theodosius and Ambrose of Milan in the late 380s exemplified this new balance of power. After a massacre at Thessalonica, Ambrose required the emperor to perform public penance, asserting the principle that even emperors were subject to church discipline. By the end of this period, the transformation initiated under Constantine was complete. Christianity had evolved from a persecuted minority faith into an imperial institution with established hierarchy, doctrine, and global reach across the Roman world. The theological controversies of the 4th century produced enduring creeds, while the integration of church and state redefined both religious and political authority in the ancient world. The close of the 4th century marked the full establishment of Christianity as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD had legally defined Nicene Christianity as the state religion, placing the church at the center of imperial administration and identity. During the following 2 centuries, the church expanded its institutional structure, solidified its theology, and navigated the gradual collapse of imperial authority in the West. The period from 380 to 600 AD witnessed the shaping of the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, the rise of monasticism as a stabilizing force, and the consolidation of ecclesiastical power amid political fragmentation. The reign of Theodosius I established the framework for church-state relations in the later Roman Empire. His enforcement of Nicene orthodoxy included laws closing pagan temples, banning sacrifices, and restricting heretical groups. These measures were implemented unevenly, but marked a decisive end to official pagan practice in most urban centers. Paganism persisted longer in rural areas, especially in Gaul and the eastern provinces, but by the early 5th century, Christian worship dominated public life. The imperial government became an active participant in ecclesiastical disputes, while bishops assumed civic roles previously held by imperial administrators. This period also witnessed the strengthening of episcopal authority and the growing influence of the Bishop of Rome. In 381 AD, Theodosius convened the First Council of Constantinople, the Second Ecumenical Council of the Church. This council reaffirmed and expanded the Nicene Creed, clarifying the doctrine of the Holy Spirit as co-equal and consubstantial with the Father and the Son. It condemned Arianism and other heresies such as Macedonianism and Apollinarianism, establishing a Trinitarian framework that would define Orthodox theology. The council also granted Constantinople honorary precedence after Rome, recognizing its political significance as the imperial capital. This decision initiated later disputes between Rome and Constantinople over jurisdictional primacy. The late 4th and early 5th centuries saw an intense period of theological and scriptural development. Figures such as Ambrose of Milan, Jerome, and Augustine of Hippo became central to the intellectual and moral direction of the Western Church. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan from 374 to 397 AD, asserted the independence of ecclesiastical authority from imperial interference. His confrontation with Emperor Theodosius over the massacre at Thessalonica demonstrated the growing moral supremacy of the Church. Jerome, active in Palestine, produced the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible around 382 AD, commissioned by Pope Damasus I. The Vulgate became the standard Latin text of Scripture for Western Christianity, influencing theology and liturgy for more than a millennium. Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430 AD, Bishop of Hippo Regius in North Africa, was among the most influential theologians of this era. His writings, Confessions, The City of God, and numerous treatises addressed central issues such as grace, free will, and the nature of the Church. During his lifetime, he opposed Donatism, a North African schism that demanded the moral purity of clergy for the validity of sacraments. Augustine argued that the Church's holiness derived from Christ, not the personal virtue of its ministers. He also refuted Pelagianism, which denied original sin and asserted human ability to achieve salvation without divine grace. Augustine's doctrine of grace, developed between 412 and 430 AD, shaped Western Christian theology and deeply influenced medieval scholasticism and Reformation thought. While theological disputes defined the intellectual life of the Church, political instability reshaped its practical functions. The Western Roman Empire entered a period of irreversible decline after the death of Theodosius in 395 AD, when the empire was permanently divided between East and West. The western provinces suffered repeated invasions by Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, and others, culminating in the sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric I. Augustine's City of God, written in response, argued that the fall of the earthly city did not threaten the eternal city of God, reinforcing the Church's spiritual authority as independent of imperial power. As imperial control weakened, bishops assumed civil leadership roles in many cities. In Rome, successive popes acted as mediators, administrators, and defenders during crises. Pope Leo I, 440 to 461 AD, known as Leo the Great, exemplified this transformation. He articulated a clear doctrine of papal supremacy based on the Petrine tradition, asserting that the Bishop of Rome inherited the authority of the Apostle Peter. His Tome of Leo, written in 449 AD, became a central text in defining Christological orthodoxy at the Council of Chalcedon 2 years later. The Council of Ephesus in 431 AD had addressed the Christological controversy sparked by Nestorius, Patriarch of Constantinople, who distinguished too sharply between the divine and human natures of Christ and rejected the title Theotokos, God-bearer, for Mary. The council condemned Nestorius and affirmed the unity of Christ's person. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD further defined orthodoxy, declaring that Christ existed in two natures, divine and human, united without confusion or separation. These decisions shaped the doctrine of the hypostatic union, which remains central to both Catholic and Orthodox theology. However, not all Christians accepted the Chalcedonian definition. Large communities in Egypt, Syria, and Armenia rejected it, leading to enduring divisions. The Coptic, Syriac, and Armenian apostolic churches emerged from these disputes, forming the family of Oriental Orthodox churches. Their separation marked one of the earliest schisms in Christian history, reflecting both theological and cultural differences within the empire. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, with Constantinople as its capital, became the center of Christian political and theological life. Under emperors such as Theodosius II, 408 to 450 AD, and Justinian I, 527 to 565 AD, the empire pursued the ideal of a unified Christian state governed by divine law. Justinian's reign epitomized this synthesis of church and empire. His Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled between 529 and 534 AD, integrated Christian moral principles into Roman law. He sponsored extensive church building, most notably the Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 AD, which symbolized the grandeur of Byzantine Christianity. Justinian also sought theological unity. He convened the Second Council of Constantinople in 553 AD to reconcile Chalcedonian and anti-Chalcedonian factions by condemning certain Nestorian writings, known as the Three Chapters. The attempt largely failed and divisions persisted. Nonetheless, the council's decrees reinforced imperial involvement in ecclesiastical affairs, illustrating the Byzantine principle of Caesaropapism, in which the emperor exercised authority over both civil and religious life. While the East maintained imperial stability, the West underwent political transformation. After the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire formally ended, and various Germanic kingdoms replaced imperial administration. The Church remained the only continuous institution linking the post-Roman West to its classical heritage. Bishops preserved literacy, law, and administration in regions where secular authority collapsed. The papacy gradually evolved into a central organizing power, coordinating missions and diplomacy across Europe. Monasticism expanded dramatically during this era. Originating in Egypt and Syria, it reached the western provinces through figures such as Martin of Tours and John Cassian. The movement was systematized by Benedict of Nursia, who founded the monastery of Monte Cassino around 529 AD. His rule of Saint Benedict established a balanced life of prayer, work, and study under communal discipline. The Benedictine model spread across Western Europe, becoming a foundation of medieval religious and cultural life. Monasteries preserved classical texts, educated clergy, and provided social stability amid political disorder. Missionary activity accompanied this monastic expansion. In Ireland, Patrick, active in the mid-5th century, organized the local church, and established monastic centers that later evangelized Scotland and Northern Europe. The Irish monastic tradition produced influential scholars such as Columba and Columbanus, who extended Christian learning and discipline into new territories. These missions laid the groundwork for the re-Christianization of Europe after the collapse of Roman authority. The relationship between Rome and the Eastern Patriarchates continued to evolve. The Council of Chalcedon had elevated Constantinople to a position of honor second only to Rome, but tensions persisted over jurisdiction and theology. The Acacian Schism, 484 to 519 AD, reflected these disputes, arising from a compromise formula issued by Emperor Zeno that sought to appease non-Chalcedonians. The schism was resolved under Pope Hormisdas, who reaffirmed Rome's doctrinal authority. The pattern of intermittent unity and division between East and West foreshadowed later conflicts leading to the Great Schism of 1054. In the late 5th and 6th centuries, the papacy continued to consolidate authority. Pope Gelasius I, 492 to 496 AD, articulated the doctrine of two powers, the sacred authority of priests and the royal power of kings, asserting that the Church held supremacy in spiritual matters. This concept provided the theoretical foundation for medieval papal claims over secular rulers. By the time of Pope Gregory I, 590 to 604 AD, known as Gregory the Great, the papacy had become both a spiritual and political power. Gregory reformed church administration, strengthened monastic life, and dispatched missionaries to convert the Anglo-Saxons, including Augustine of Canterbury, who began the Christianization of England in 597 AD. His pastoral rule became a standard manual for bishops throughout the medieval period. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine East, theological controversies continued to occupy imperial and ecclesiastical leaders. The debates over Monophysitism and the attempts at reconciliation through imperial edicts reflected ongoing tension between doctrinal purity and political unity. The empire also faced new external pressures. The Persian Wars and the rise of the Slavs and Avars along the northern borders strained resources and reduced imperial control in some provinces. Yet the Byzantine Church maintained a high degree of organization and intellectual vitality, preserving Greek theological scholarship and liturgical tradition. By 600 AD, the Church had become the dominant cultural, moral, and intellectual authority across both Eastern and Western Christendom. The transformation from a persecuted sect to an imperial institution was complete. The Western Church, centered in Rome, had assumed leadership in a fragmented political landscape, while the Eastern Church, aligned with the Byzantine state, maintained continuity with the imperial legacy of Rome. The theological foundations established by the councils of Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon remained the defining framework of Christian orthodoxy. Monasticism provided stability and education, and missionary networks extended Christianity's reach beyond the former boundaries of the Roman world. The 7th to 11th centuries marked a critical stage in the development of Western Christianity. During this period, the Church became the primary unifying institution across post-Roman Europe, extending its influence into governance, education, and culture. The papacy evolved from a regional episcopate into a central authority that shaped both religious and political life. Monasticism reached new levels of organization and reform. Missionary activity expanded Christianity across Northern and Eastern Europe, and the growing divide between the Latin West and the Greek East deepened, laying the groundwork for the eventual Schism of 1054. At the beginning of the 7th century, Pope Gregory I, 590 to 604 AD, known as Gregory the Great, established many of the administrative and doctrinal foundations that defined the medieval papacy. His pontificate coincided with the collapse of imperial power in Italy following the Lombard invasions. Gregory reorganized the papal estates to support charity and defense, managed relations with Lombard rulers, and reasserted the independence of the Roman See. His emphasis on pastoral care and clerical discipline was codified in the Pastoral Rule, a manual for bishops that became widely influential throughout the Latin Church. Gregory also promoted missionary work beyond the boundaries of the Old Empire. In 596 AD, he sent Augustine of Canterbury to England, initiating the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. The mission's success led to the establishment of Christian communities in Canterbury, Rochester, and London by the early 7th century. In the centuries that followed, missionary activity became a defining feature of the medieval church's expansion. In Ireland, the earlier work of Patrick had laid a monastic foundation that influenced missions across northern Europe. Irish monks such as Columbanus, 543 to 615 AD, traveled to Gaul and Italy, founding monasteries at Luxeuil and Bobbio that became centers of learning and reform. From these missions, the monastic tradition spread through Frankish territories, influencing both religious life and education. Later, Anglo-Saxon missionaries extended Christian influence eastward. Willibrord evangelized Frisia around 690 AD, while Boniface, born Winfrith of Wessex, c. 675 to 754 AD, became the leading missionary of the 8th century. Commissioned by Pope Gregory II, Boniface organized the German Church, established dioceses, and strengthened papal authority in the region. His martyrdom in Frisia in 754 symbolized the missionary zeal that characterized the Carolingian Age. By the early 8th century, the political structure of Western Europe was transforming. The Carolingian dynasty rose to prominence within the Frankish kingdom, forming a close alliance with the papacy. In 732 AD, Charles Martel halted Muslim expansion into Gaul at the Battle of Tours, securing the survival of Christian Europe in the West. His son, Pepin the Short, sought papal legitimacy to strengthen his rule. In 751 AD, Pope Zachary endorsed Pepin's deposition of the Merovingian king Childeric III, and in 754, Pope Stephen II anointed Pepin, establishing a precedent for papal involvement in royal succession. In gratitude, Pepin granted territory in central Italy to the papacy, the donation of Pepin, which became the foundation of the Papal States. Under Charlemagne, Pepin's son, the alliance between the papacy and the Frankish monarchy deepened further. Charlemagne, 768 to 814 AD, expanded his empire across Western and Central Europe, promoting the Christianization of conquered peoples. The Saxon Wars, 772 to 804 AD, resulted in the forced conversion of the Saxons, while missions extended into Bavaria and Lombardy. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans in Rome, reviving the concept of a Western Empire and symbolizing the unity of church and state. The coronation reinforced papal prestige, but also created enduring tension between papal and imperial authority, as later rulers interpreted the event as legitimizing their control over the church. Charlemagne's reign also saw significant reforms in education and ecclesiastical administration. The Carolingian Renaissance fostered the establishment of cathedral schools and monastic scriptoria, standardizing Latin learning and liturgical practice. Alcuin of York, a scholar from Northumbria, directed educational reforms that influenced generations of clergy. The uniform adoption of the Roman liturgy, combined with the Gregorian chant tradition, brought greater cohesion to Western worship. The production of biblical manuscripts, including illuminated Gospels and Psalters, preserved classical texts and advanced literacy within monastic communities. After Charlemagne's death, the unity of the Carolingian Empire disintegrated, but the institutional church remained stable. In the 9th century, papal authority continued to expand despite political fragmentation. Pope Nicholas I, 858 to 867 AD, asserted the independence of the papacy from secular control and defended papal supremacy in disputes with both emperors and patriarchs. His confrontation with Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, initiated the Photian Schism, 863 to 867 AD, an early indicator of the growing divergence between the Latin and Greek churches. The dispute revolved around papal jurisdiction in Bulgaria and doctrinal differences concerning the procession of the Holy Spirit, the Filioque clause, added by the Western Church to the Nicene Creed. Though the schism was temporarily resolved, it revealed deep cultural and theological divisions. Monasticism in the West continued to evolve as both a spiritual and organizational force. The rule of Saint Benedict, emphasizing stability, obedience, and communal life, became the standard across Western Christendom. Monasteries functioned not only as religious centers, but also as hubs of agriculture, education, and manuscript preservation. However, the 9th and 10th centuries brought internal decline due to feudal interference, moral laxity, and economic exploitation. In response, new reform movements emerged. The Cluniac Reform, beginning in 910 AD with the foundation of the Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy, sought to restore strict adherence to the Benedictine rule and independence from secular lords. The Cluniac network expanded rapidly, establishing hundreds of affiliated monasteries across Europe. The movement revitalized spiritual discipline, standardized liturgical practice, and enhanced the moral influence of monasticism on broader society. During the same period, the papacy endured periods of weakness, often dominated by Roman aristocratic families and political factions. The 10th century, sometimes referred to as the Saeculum Obscurum or Dark Age of the papacy, saw frequent corruption and instability. Despite this, reform-minded leaders gradually restored papal integrity. The influence of monastic reformers, particularly from Cluny, culminated in a series of 11th century popes who reasserted spiritual authority. Pope Leo IX, 1049 to 1054 AD, himself a former Cluniac monk, spearheaded the Gregorian reform movement that would later reshape the Church's structure and its relationship with secular power. The expansion of Christianity continued in Northern and Eastern Europe. By the early 10th century, Scandinavia was being gradually Christianized through missions supported by both Anglo-Saxon and Frankish clergy. Denmark converted under King Harald Bluetooth around 965 AD, followed by Norway under Olaf Tryggvason, r. 995 to 1000 AD, and Olaf II Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, d. 1030 AD. Sweden's conversion was more gradual, extending through the 11th century. In Central Europe, Christianization advanced through political alliance and royal initiative. The Duchy of Bohemia converted under Duke Wenceslas I, c. 907 to 935 AD, and Poland adopted Christianity officially under Duke Mieszko I in 966 AD, aligning with the Latin Church. Further east, the baptism of Kievan Rus in 988 AD under Prince Vladimir I introduced Byzantine Christianity to Eastern Europe, linking the region culturally and religiously to Constantinople. The 10th century also witnessed the formation of new Christian monarchies closely tied to the Papacy. The Holy Roman Empire, founded under Otto I, crowned 962 AD, represented the continuation of the Carolingian legacy. Otto's successors exercised significant influence over episcopal appointments, creating tensions between imperial and papal authority that foreshadowed later conflicts. The Ettonian Renaissance, centered in Germany, encouraged cathedral building, scriptural scholarship, and liturgical standardization, reinforcing the cultural dominance of the Church. Intellectually, the medieval Church preserved and transmitted classical learning. Monastic scriptoria produced copies of biblical and patristic works, while cathedral schools developed curricula based on grammar, rhetoric, and theology. These schools provided the foundation for the later rise of universities in the 12th century. Theological synthesis remained grounded in Augustinian thought, emphasizing divine grace and the moral role of the Church as the guardian of truth and order. Canon law evolved alongside theology, with collections of ecclesiastical decrees circulating among clerics to standardize discipline. Doctrinally, debates continued between the Eastern and Western churches over liturgical and theological issues. The Western edition of the Filioque Clause, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, remained controversial in the East, which held to the original Nicene formulation. Disputes over clerical celibacy, the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and papal claims of universal jurisdiction further strained relations. Political rivalry between the Papacy and Byzantine emperors, combined with linguistic and cultural divergence, eroded mutual recognition between Rome and Constantinople. By the early 11th century, the Western Church had achieved an unprecedented level of organization. The diocesan system provided hierarchical coherence, with archbishops and metropolises coordinating regional synods. The Papacy, though not yet fully centralized, exercised authority through legates and correspondence. Ecclesiastical courts administered canon law, and monastic reform movements maintained spiritual renewal. Pilgrimage and relic veneration became integral aspects of lay devotion, linking remote communities to the broader Christian world. The period also saw the emergence of reformist ideals that would dominate the 11th century. Clerical celibacy, simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and lay investiture became central issues for papal reformers seeking to assert spiritual independence from feudal control. These initiatives culminated later under Pope Gregory VII, 1073 to 1085 AD, but their foundations were laid during this earlier period of consolidation. The papacy's moral authority, supported by monastic networks, positioned it to challenge secular rulers in defining the balance of power between church and state. By 1054, centuries of doctrinal divergence, political competition, and cultural isolation between East and West reached a breaking point. The mutual excommunications issued between Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, representing Pope Leo IX, and Patriarch Michael Cerularius formalized the Great Schism, permanently dividing Christianity into the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. Though the separation resulted from accumulated tensions rather than a single event, it marked the culmination of developments stretching back to the early medieval period. From 600 to 1054 AD, the Church transformed into a structured and expansive institution, defining Western civilization's moral, intellectual, and political framework. The Papacy's rise, monastic reform, missionary expansion, and theological consolidation shaped the course of Christian history and prepared the foundations for the medieval order that would dominate Europe for the next several centuries. The 11th to 13th centuries marked a period of consolidation and intellectual expansion in the Western Church following the Great Schism of 1054. This era saw the Latin Church solidify its political authority, define its theological framework, and exert unmatched influence over European life. The papacy became both a spiritual and temporal force. Monarchs were compelled to recognize ecclesiastical supremacy, and universities emerged as centers of systematic theology. The investiture controversy, beginning in 1075, revealed the struggle between papal and imperial authority. Pope Gregory VII asserted that only the Pope could appoint bishops and depose emperors, issuing the Dictatus Papae. Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV resisted, maintaining that rulers had the right to invest bishops with symbols of their office. The conflict reached its height when Henry was excommunicated in 1076. His subsequent journey to Canossa in 1077 to seek papal absolution demonstrated the growing power of the papacy over kings. Although the Concordat of Worms in 1122 finally resolved the issue by separating spiritual and temporal investiture, the conflict permanently altered the balance of power in medieval Europe. During this same period, religious reform movements emerged to counter corruption and reinforce discipline. The Cluniac reforms, originating in the Abbey of Cluny in 910, spread across Europe, emphasizing monastic purity, liturgical devotion, and independence from secular control. Later, the Cistercian movement, founded in 1098 by Robert of Molesme, sought stricter adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict, stressing manual labor and simplicity. Bernard of Clairvaux became its leading voice, promoting moral reform and supporting the Second Crusade. These monastic reforms revitalized spiritual life and contributed to the spread of agricultural and educational advancement throughout Christendom. The Crusades also defined this era, initiated by Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095. His call for Christian knights to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule ignited the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, which captured the city in 1099 and established Latin states in the Levant. Over the next 2 centuries, several crusades followed, some aimed at defending the Holy Land, others targeting heretical movements in Europe or political enemies of the papacy. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, failed to achieve its objectives, while the Third, 1189 to 1192, brought together Europe's most powerful monarchs, Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa, against Saladin. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, ended in the sack of Constantinople, deepening the rift between the Eastern and Western churches. The Crusades reshaped Europe's economy, trade, and worldview. Contact with Byzantine and Muslim civilizations reintroduced classical knowledge and technology to the West, sparking renewed intellectual curiosity. Pilgrimage routes, military orders such as the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, and increased maritime commerce tied Europe to the broader Mediterranean world. Although the Crusades failed to secure lasting control over the Holy Land, they strengthened papal authority and fostered the notion of Christendom as a unified entity under Rome's spiritual leadership. By the 12th century, theological inquiry took on a systematic form. The development of scholasticism represented an attempt to reconcile Christian doctrine with reason and philosophy, particularly Aristotelian thought. Anselm of Canterbury, known for his ontological argument for God's existence, introduced rational analysis into theology. Peter Abelard's sic et non, yes and no, further encouraged critical comparison of authoritative sources. The culmination of scholastic method came in the 13th century with Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica sought to harmonize faith and reason within a comprehensive theological system. The rise of universities paralleled this intellectual movement. The University of Bologna, specializing in canon law, and the University of Paris, focused on theology, became leading centers of education. Oxford and Cambridge soon followed. These institutions, initially attached to cathedral schools, formalized the study of theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts. The use of Latin as the academic language maintained a unified intellectual culture across Europe. Graduates from these universities filled administrative, ecclesiastical, and scholarly roles throughout Christendom, strengthening the institutional church's dominance over cultural life. Papal authority reached its zenith under Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216. He expanded the papacy's temporal influence, asserting that the Pope stood above all earthly rulers in spiritual matters. Innocent III's reign saw the convening of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which standardized church doctrine, reformed clerical conduct, and established the doctrine of transubstantiation. The council also required annual confession and communion for all Christians and mandated efforts to suppress heresy. Under Innocent's direction, papal legates exercised authority across Europe, ensuring compliance with Rome's decrees. However, the same period witnessed the emergence of dissenting movements. The Cathars in southern France rejected the material world and the authority of the papacy, viewing the church as corrupt. Their beliefs prompted the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, a brutal campaign endorsed by Innocent III that devastated the Languedoc region. The Waldensians, founded by Peter Waldo of Lyon around 1170, advocated apostolic poverty and the preaching of Scripture in vernacular languages. Although initially reform-minded, they were condemned for challenging clerical authority and the church hierarchy. These heretical movements revealed a growing desire for spiritual authenticity among the laity. The rise of mendicant orders provided a legitimate outlet for this spiritual yearning. Francis of Assisi founded the Franciscan order in 1209, embracing poverty, humility, and service. The Dominicans, established by Dominic de Guzman in 1216, focused on preaching and combating heresy through education. Both orders revitalized pastoral care and became central to the intellectual life of the Church. Figures such as Bonaventure and Albertus Magnus, both members of mendicant orders, further advanced scholastic thought and theological education. Architecture reflected the confidence and power of the medieval church. The Romanesque style, characterized by massive stone walls and rounded arches, gave way to the Gothic, with its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and stained glass windows. Cathedrals like Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, and Canterbury became not only centers of worship, but also symbols of civic pride and artistic achievement. Their construction, often spanning generations, represented collective devotion and the Church's central place in medieval society. Economically, the Church controlled vast estates, collected tithes, and operated monasteries that functioned as centers of production, education, and hospitality. Monastic orders preserved classical texts, advanced agricultural practices, and provided care for the poor. Pilgrimages to relic sites such as Santiago de Compostela and Rome generated significant income and reinforced shared religious identity. The papacy also developed a complex system of taxation and indulgences to fund its administration and military ventures. By the end of the 13th century, the Church stood as the most powerful institution in Europe. It exercised authority over kings, influenced the formation of legal systems, and dominated intellectual life. Yet, its very power and wealth sowed the seeds of future challenges. Tensions between spiritual ideals and temporal control became increasingly visible. Monarchs such as Philip IV of France began to contest papal interference in state affairs, setting the stage for later conflicts. The period from 1054 to 1300 defined the Western Church's character. It achieved institutional maturity, intellectual sophistication, and cultural dominance unmatched in earlier centuries. The fusion of theology, politics, and education shaped medieval civilization, but the concentration of power within the papacy and clergy also created structural vulnerabilities. These developments would directly influence the crises and transformations of the late medieval era. The 14th and early 15th centuries were marked by crisis, fragmentation, and reform within the Western Church. After centuries of expansion and consolidation, the Church entered a period of political interference, moral decay, and institutional paralysis that weakened its authority. The combination of papal disputes, social upheaval, and intellectual criticism exposed deep flaws in ecclesiastical governance and faith practice, paving the way for the transformations that would follow in the Reformation era. By 1300, papal power had reached its height under Pope Boniface VIII. He issued the bull Unam Sanctum in 1302, asserting that salvation was possible only through submission to the Pope, and that the spiritual authority of the papacy was superior to all temporal power. This claim brought him into conflict with King Philip IV of France, who resented papal interference in French taxation and governance. The confrontation escalated when Philip's agents captured Boniface at Anagni in 1303. Though quickly released, the event humiliated the papacy and demonstrated the shifting balance of power towards secular rulers. After Boniface's death, Philip IV influenced the election of a French pope, Clement V, who moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon in 1309. This relocation began the period known as the Avignon Papacy, lasting until 1377. For nearly 70 years, 7 successive popes resided in Avignon under heavy French influence. The papal court became associated with wealth, bureaucracy, and political manipulation. Although the Avignon popes improved administrative efficiency and centralized finances, their absence from Rome damaged their spiritual credibility. The image of the papacy as captive to French interests provoked resentment throughout Europe. During this period, The church faced financial strain due to wars and the costs of maintaining the papal court. To sustain its income, the papacy expanded the sale of benefices, indulgences, and clerical appointments, practices increasingly viewed as corrupt. The growing gap between the church's moral authority and its fiscal policies alienated many believers. Meanwhile, monastic reform waned, and many religious institutions became entangled in landholding and politics, departing from their original ideals of poverty and service. In 1347, the arrival of the Black Death intensified the church's crisis. The plague, which spread across Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. The church was unable to provide spiritual or practical relief on a meaningful scale. Many clergy died caring for the sick, while others fled their parishes. The inability of priests and bishops to explain or stop the disaster eroded confidence in ecclesiastical leadership. The resulting demographic collapse left monasteries deserted, parishes vacant, and the faithful questioning divine justice and the church's efficacy. As papal absence continued, calls for reform grew louder. Catherine of Siena, a Dominican tertiary, wrote letters urging Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome. Responding to mounting criticism and political instability, he finally restored the papacy to Rome in 1377. His death the following year, however, triggered the Western Schism, one of the most severe institutional breakdowns in church history. In 1378, under pressure from the Roman populace to elect an Italian pope, the cardinals chose Urban VI. Soon after, dissenting cardinals declared his election invalid, claiming it was made under duress, and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who re-established his court in Avignon. Europe was divided along political lines. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Northern Europe supported Urban in Rome. France, Scotland, and parts of Spain supported Clement in Avignon. This dual papacy created confusion among clergy and laity alike. Each pope excommunicated the other, and both levied taxes and appointed bishops, undermining ecclesiastical legitimacy. The schism lasted nearly 40 years, deepening cynicism and weakening unity. Theologians and reformers sought solutions through the concept of conciliarism, the idea that an ecumenical council held authority above the pope. This principle gained traction with the Council of Pisa in 1409, which attempted to end the schism by deposing both existing popes and electing Alexander V. Instead of resolution, the church now had 3 rival popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one from Pisa. The stalemate continued until the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, convened by Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund and Pope John XI of the Pisan line. The council deposed or accepted the resignation of all claimants and elected Martin V in 1417, restoring a single papal line in Rome. The council also condemned heresy and sought institutional reform, though many of its decrees were later ignored by the papacy. While Constance ended the schism, it exposed the fragility of papal supremacy and demonstrated the Church's dependence on secular powers to restore order. Parallel to these internal crises, theological and social movements began challenging the Church's authority. John Wycliffe, an English scholar at Oxford, questioned the wealth of the clergy and the doctrine of transubstantiation. He advocated for scripture in the vernacular and emphasized the Bible as the sole authority for Christian faith. His followers, known as Lollards, spread his teachings despite persecution. In Bohemia, Jan Hus, influenced by Wycliffe's writings, denounced ecclesiastical corruption and papal abuses from the University of Prague. Summoned to the Council of Constance under promise of safe conduct, Hus was arrested, tried, and executed by burning in 1415. His death sparked the Hussite Wars, 1419 to 1436, in which Bohemian reformers resisted papal and imperial forces, signaling the first large-scale revolt against church authority in Europe. While heresy trials intensified, mysticism and personal piety movements grew among ordinary Christians. The Devotio Moderna movement in the Low Countries emphasized inner spirituality and ethical living rather than external ritual. It produced influential works such as The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, which encouraged humility and direct devotion to God. Such trends reflected a shift toward personal faith that bypassed traditional clerical mediation. Meanwhile, the papacy attempted to reassert its position after the schism. Martin V and his successors sought to restore Rome's authority but faced continuing opposition from conciliarists. The Council of Basel, 1431 to 1449, revived debates about whether councils or popes held supreme power. The council condemned several papal policies, supported reform of the clergy, and even attempted to depose Pope Eugenius IV. The conflict ended with the Pope reasserting authority, but the idea that church councils could act independently remained influential among reformers and scholars. Economic and political conditions further eroded confidence in the papacy. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, became widespread. Nepotism and pluralism were common, with clerics holding multiple benefices simultaneously. Papal taxation and indulgence sales increased to fund wars, art projects, and bureaucratic expansion. Rome itself, rebuilt under papal patronage, displayed the wealth of the church in contrast to the poverty of the faithful. Despite internal decay, this period saw intellectual and cultural developments that would later reshape the church. The rise of scholasticism's late phase blended with humanist thought emerging in Italy. Scholars such as Petrarch and Lorenzo Valla began studying classical texts, promoting critical methods that challenged traditional theological frameworks. Valla's analysis of the donation of Constantine in the 1440s demonstrated that the document, long used to justify papal temporal authority, was a forgery. His discovery undermined centuries of papal claims to political supremacy. Missionary activity continued modestly during this era, especially through mendicant orders. Franciscans and Dominicans spread Christianity in the Baltic region and among Mongol and Chinese populations, though limited by political instability and distance. Contacts with the Orthodox Church also fluctuated. Efforts to reunite the Eastern and Western churches culminated in the Council of Florence, 1438 to 1439, where Byzantine representatives agreed to union under papal authority. However, widespread opposition in Constantinople rendered the agreement ineffective. The final decades of this era witnessed the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks. The city's capture ended the Byzantine Empire and transformed the balance of power in Eastern Christianity. Many Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing classical manuscripts that fueled the Renaissance. The event also heightened Western fears of Islamic expansion and further solidified the papacy's role as defender of Christendom. By the mid-15th century, the Church remained outwardly dominant but inwardly compromised. The Avignon Papacy, the Great Schism, and repeated failures at reform had damaged its moral credibility. Intellectual inquiry, lay spirituality, and national monarchies were rising forces that no longer accepted papal control without question. The tension between tradition and renewal, between spiritual mission and institutional corruption, now defined the late medieval church. Its unresolved contradictions would lead directly into the era of the Reformation. The 14th and 15th centuries marked one of the most complex and troubled eras in church history. The Western Church, dominant in Europe for centuries, entered a prolonged period of crisis defined by moral decline, institutional corruption, theological debate, and intellectual renewal. Political interference in papal affairs, clerical abuses, and economic exploitation eroded confidence in the Church's leadership, while new currents of thought, reform movements, and popular piety challenged long-standing traditions. Between 1300 and 1500, the Church's unity weakened, and many of the issues that would fuel the Reformation were already visible. At the beginning of the 14th century, papal prestige was high, but political realities soon undermined it. Pope Boniface VIII's confrontation with King Philip IV of France in 1302 represented the climax of medieval papal authority and its limits. Boniface issued Unam Sanctum, asserting papal supremacy over secular rulers, but Philip responded by accusing him of corruption and heresy. In 1303, royal agents captured Boniface at Anagni. Although he was released shortly afterward, the incident demonstrated that the papacy could no longer dominate monarchs as it once had under Innocent III. Boniface's death that same year closed the age of papal supremacy. Under pressure from Philip IV, Pope Clement V relocated the papal residence to Avignon in 1309, inaugurating the period known as the Avignon Papacy. From 1309 to 1377, 7 popes resided in Avignon, all French by origin. While Avignon became an efficient administrative center, the papacy's dependence on the French crown damaged its universal image. The papal court developed an elaborate bureaucracy and imposed new taxes on clergy throughout Europe. Financial abuses became common, and resentment grew in England, Germany, and Italy. The term Babylonian captivity of the papacy, coined later by critics, reflected the widespread view that the popes were prisoners of French influence. During this same period, broader crises shook Europe. The 100 Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453, drained economies and disrupted church networks. The Black Death, which began in 1347, killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population by 1351. Clergy mortality was high, and the Church's inability to prevent or explain the plague diminished its spiritual authority. Many survivors interpreted the catastrophe as divine punishment, while others turned to mysticism and personal piety for comfort. When Pope Gregory XI finally returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, the Church was politically divided and spiritually weakened. His death in 1378 triggered the Great Western Schism. The election of Urban VI, an Italian pope unpopular with French cardinals, led to the election of a rival pontiff, Clement VII, who re-established his court in Avignon. Europe fractured along political lines. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Northern Europe supported Urban, while France, Scotland, and Spain followed Clement. Both claimed legitimacy, excommunicated each other, and appointed rival bishops. For nearly 40 years, Christendom had two, and later three, competing popes. The schism revealed deep structural problems within the Church. Papal claims to spiritual unity collapsed under political pressure, and ordinary Christians were forced to choose between competing pontiffs. Each papal court demanded taxes and loyalty, while moral authority eroded further. Theologians began to explore solutions that limited papal power through councils. The theory of conciliarism held that an ecumenical council represented the universal church and held supreme authority in matters of faith and governance, even above the Pope. The Council of Pisa in 1409 attempted to resolve the schism by deposing both existing popes and electing a new one, Alexander V. Instead of restoring unity, the Church now had three popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one from Pisa. Resolution came only with the Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, convened under the auspices of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. The council successfully ended the schism by deposing or accepting the resignation of all claimants and electing Martin V in 1417. The Council of Constance also condemned the teachings of reformers John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, who had criticized ecclesiastical corruption and papal excess. Hus was burned at the stake in 1415, provoking the Hussite Wars in Bohemia and becoming an early martyr for reform. Despite the restoration of papal unity, conciliar reform failed to achieve lasting change. The papacy reasserted its supremacy over councils during the 15th century. The Council of Basel, 1431 to 1449, reopened the question of papal authority but ended in disarray when Pope Eugenius IV dissolved it and transferred its sessions to Ferrara and Florence. The conciliar movement declined, leaving the Church once again centralized but unreformed. The papal administration in the 15th century became increasingly secularized. Popes such as Nicholas V, 1447 to 1455, Pius II, 1458 to 1464, Sixtus IV, 1471 to 1484, and Alexander VI, 1492 to 1503, were more patrons of art and politics than spiritual leaders. Under their leadership, Rome was transformed architecturally, but moral decay was visible. Nepotism and simony flourished. Papal relatives received cardinalates and lands. Indulgences were sold to finance construction projects, including St. Peter's Basilica. While the Renaissance papacy promoted humanist scholarship and artistic achievements, it alienated many believers who viewed the Church as worldly and corrupt. Parallel to papal decline, religious life in Europe diversified. Monastic orders faced internal decay, though some movements sought reform. The Carthusians maintained strict discipline, while the Franciscans and Dominicans continued to focus on preaching and education. New congregations, such as the Observant Franciscans, emphasized poverty and moral renewal. The spread of the Devotio Moderna in the Low Countries encouraged a return to inward spirituality and personal devotion. Its most famous text, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, stressed humility and inner faith over ritual observance. Education and literacy expanded, leading to new forms of religious engagement. Universities across Europe produced theologians who debated ecclesiology, scripture, and ethics. Scholars like Jean Gerson of Paris advocated reform through councils and clerical education. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 further accelerated the spread of ideas. For the first time, texts could be mass-produced, enabling wide circulation of theological arguments, devotional manuals, and eventually, vernacular Bibles. The late medieval period also witnessed tension between growing national monarchies and the papacy. In England, the Statutes of Provisors, 1351, and Praemunire, 1353, restricted papal interference in local appointments and courts. In France, the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourges, 1438, asserted the authority of national councils and limited papal revenue collection. In Germany, the Reichskirche, or imperial church system, reflected the increasing independence of regional bishops and princes from papal control. The political fragmentation of Europe weakened the universal claim of Rome. In the intellectual sphere, humanism began to reshape theological inquiry. Renaissance scholars studied classical languages and texts to recover the sources of Christian doctrine. Lorenzo Valla's textual criticism of the donation of Constantine, 1440, proved it a forgery, undermining the papacy's justification for temporal power. In Florence, Marsilio Ficino translated Platonic works and integrated philosophy with Christian theology. This intellectual revival encouraged critical thinking about church traditions and history, laying the groundwork for future reformers. Relations between Eastern and Western Christianity also shifted. The Byzantine Empire, long weakened by internal strife and external pressure, sought Western assistance against the Ottoman Turks. The Council of Florence, 1438 to 1439, briefly achieved a formal union between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, but opposition from Byzantine clergy and laity rendered it ineffective. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the union collapsed entirely. The event shocked Christian Europe, reinforcing calls for renewal and unity within the Latin Church. Social and economic conditions added to the atmosphere of unrest. Urbanization, economic inequality, and peasant revolts reflected widespread dissatisfaction with authority. Many parish priests were poorly educated, and abuses such as pluralism, holding multiple benefices, and absenteeism were common. Pilgrimages and relic cults remained popular, but increasing numbers of believers turned to personal prayer and vernacular devotional literature. Women's participation in lay religious movements, including the Beguines, demonstrated an expanding but unofficial sphere of spiritual engagement outside the control of the clergy. By the close of the 15th century, the Church's contradictions were evident. It remained the most powerful institution in Europe, possessing immense landholdings, wealth, and influence over education, politics, and culture. Yet beneath this surface lay widespread disillusionment. The papacy's moral authority was compromised by corruption and political entanglement. Clerical abuses persisted despite repeated reform decrees. Intellectual currents encouraged independent inquiry, while new technologies allowed ideas to circulate beyond the control of church officials. Reform proposals emerged from every level of society. Within the church, councils and synods demanded stricter discipline, improved education for priests, and limits on papal taxation. Outside it, voices like Wycliffe S. and Huss S. had already foreshadowed demands for scriptural primacy and moral integrity. By 1500, Europe stood at a historical crossroads. The medieval church, once unified and dominant, was internally fractured and externally challenged. The groundwork for transformation was firmly in place, awaiting only the catalyst that would soon appear in the early 16th century. In 1517, the established order of Western Christendom fractured. The unity that had defined the Latin Church for over a millennium was challenged by theological dissent, moral outrage, and political ambition. The movement began in the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire when an Augustinian monk, Martin Luther, published his 95 Theses on October 31, 1517. His criticism of the sale of indulgences by papal representatives, notably Johann Tetzel, ignited widespread debate on the nature of salvation, authority, and the Church itself. Luther's initial intent was reform, not separation. However, the papal response escalated the conflict. Pope Leo X condemned his propositions in the 1520 bull Ex Surge Domini. Luther refused to recant, burning the bull publicly. In 1521, he was excommunicated and declared an outlaw at the Diet of Worms, under Emperor Charles V. His refusal to recant before imperial and ecclesiastical authority marked the formal beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Protected by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, Luther translated the New Testament into German, providing ordinary people direct access to Scripture for the first time in their language. Across Europe, similar reforming impulses emerged independently. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli led reform in Zurich from 1523, rejecting the Mass, clerical celibacy, and the authority of the Pope. His movement was more radical in its iconoclasm, removing images and relics from churches. In Geneva, John Calvin established a disciplined Reformed community after 1536, emphasizing predestination and strict moral governance. His Institutes of the Christian Religion became the foundational theological text for the Reformed tradition. The Radical Reformation also took shape. The Anabaptists rejected infant baptism, arguing for voluntary faith and believers' baptism. Their emphasis on separation from worldly power brought persecution from both Catholics and Protestants. The movement produced diverse groups, from peaceful Mennonites under Menno Simons to revolutionary Anabaptists who briefly controlled Munster in 1534 to 1535. In England, the Reformation took a distinctive course. King Henry VIII, initially a staunch defender of papal authority, broke with Rome in 1534 when Pope Clement VII refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Through the Act of Supremacy, Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation, at first political, evolved into a theological conflict under his successors. Edward VI's reign saw Protestant reforms take root. Mary I's restoration of Catholicism led to persecution of Protestants. Elizabeth I's 1559 settlement sought a moderate compromise, establishing Anglicanism as a distinct form of Christianity. By the 1540s, Protestant ideas had spread across much of Northern Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, parts of Switzerland, and the Netherlands. Southern Europe and much of Eastern Europe remained Catholic. The Church in Rome responded with the Counter-Reformation, a comprehensive internal reform movement that reasserted Catholic doctrine, renewed spiritual discipline, and sought to reclaim lost territories. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, convened under Popes Paul III, Julius III, and Pius IV, became the defining moment of Catholic renewal. The Council reaffirmed traditional teachings on Scripture and tradition, justification, the sacraments, and clerical celibacy. It standardized liturgy, leading to the publication of the Roman Missal in 1570 and mandated seminary training for priests. These reforms aimed to restore moral integrity and intellectual rigor within the Church. New religious orders played a central role. The Society of Jesus, Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, became the intellectual and missionary vanguard of Catholicism. Jesuits established schools, advised monarchs, and led global missions from Asia to the Americas. Other new or reformed orders, such as the Capuchins, Ursulines, and Discalced Carmelites, emphasized education, charity, and spiritual renewal. The Catholic Reformation extended beyond Europe. In Asia, Jesuit missionaries such as Francis Xavier reached India, Japan, and later the Philippines. Matteo Ricci entered China in 1583, adapting Christian teaching to Confucian culture. In the Americas, Catholicism spread through colonization. Spanish and Portuguese missions converted indigenous populations, establishing enduring institutions like the cathedral system in Mexico City and Lima. Meanwhile, Europe descended into religious wars. The German Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, reflected social unrest fueled partly by Reformation rhetoric, though Luther opposed the rebellion. The Schmalkaldic Wars, 1546 to 1555, between Catholic and Protestant princes ended with the Peace of Augsburg, granting legal recognition to Lutheranism within the empire. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, allowed rulers to determine their state's religion but excluded Calvinists and other groups. France endured decades of civil war between Catholics and Huguenots. The massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, where thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris and other cities, epitomized the conflict's brutality. Peace came only with Henry Ivy's Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting limited toleration to Protestants. In the Netherlands, Calvinist resistance against Spanish rule evolved into the 80 Years' War, 1568 to 1648, ending with Dutch independence and the establishment of a reformed state. In England, the Elizabethan settlement stabilized religion, but the following century saw renewed turmoil between Anglicans, Puritans, and Catholics, culminating in the English Civil War. The Reformation also reshaped education and literacy. Protestantism's emphasis on Scripture encouraged widespread Bible reading. By 1600, literacy rates in Protestant regions had risen markedly compared to Catholic areas. New confessional cultures developed, each with its own catechisms, hymnals, and educational systems. Printing, already central to Luther's success, became a weapon of ideological conflict, producing vast amounts of polemical literature. Art and architecture diverged sharply between confessions. Protestant areas favored simplicity and focus on preaching, while the Catholic world embraced the Baroque style as a visual expression of renewed faith and grandeur. Artists such as Caravaggio and Rubens were commissioned to communicate Catholic theology through dramatic realism and emotional intensity, contrasting the austere interiors of Reformed churches. The final phase of the Reformation era coincided with the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, the most destructive conflict in Europe before the 20th century. Initially a religious war within the Holy Roman Empire, it expanded into a pan-European struggle involving nearly all major powers. The war devastated Germany's population. Some regions lost up to 40%. The conflict ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, recognizing Calvinism alongside Lutheranism and Catholicism, and establishing the principle of state sovereignty that redefined Europe's political order. By 1648, Europe's religious map was permanently altered. The northern states, Scandinavia, northern Germany, England, Scotland, and the Dutch Republic, were predominantly Protestant. Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and much of France remained firmly Catholic. Central and Eastern Europe remained mixed. The global influence of Christianity had expanded dramatically, with missionary networks spanning Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation transformed not only doctrine but also society, governance, and identity. They redefined the relationship between faith and political authority, encouraged literacy and education, and laid the foundations for religious pluralism. The Church, though divided, emerged as a global institution extending far beyond its European origins. The Papacy had reasserted its moral leadership, while Protestant churches developed structures independent of Rome. Together, they ushered in the modern age of Christianity, characterized by diversity, competition, and global reach. By the mid-17th century, Christianity was no longer a monolithic institution centered solely on Rome. It had become a collection of competing confessions: Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican, and others, each claiming continuity with the Apostolic faith. The centuries that followed would see these traditions spread further, shaping empires, nations, and cultures across the world. After the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Europe entered a new phase in both politics and religion. The wars of faith had exhausted nations, populations, and economies. The treaty recognized the sovereignty of states and established a balance between Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed territories, ending the dream of a single, unified Christendom in Europe. Christianity no longer functioned as a single religious empire, but as a network of independent churches, each connected to regional politics, culture, and education. The period that followed marked the beginning of global Christianity, driven by exploration, colonization, and organized missionary work. In Catholic Europe, the Counter-Reformation momentum continued through the 17th century. The Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, and other orders expanded their missions to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. In Asia, Jesuit missionaries such as Matteo Ricci, Roberto de Nobili, and Johann Adamschal von Bell established influential missions in China and India. Ricci's approach, begun in 1583, continued into this era, emphasizing cultural adaptation and dialogue with Confucian scholars. His successors introduced Western science, mathematics, and astronomy to China's imperial court, securing positions within the Bureau of Astronomy. In Japan, however, Christianity suffered complete suppression. After decades of persecution beginning in the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate banned the religion entirely. By the mid-1600s, Japan was closed to missionaries, and thousands of Japanese Christians had been executed. Christianity survived only underground, with the so-called hidden Christians, Kakur-Kurishiden, preserving fragments of faith and secrecy for over 2 centuries. In the Americas, the Catholic Church became deeply embedded in colonial structures. Spain and Portugal saw themselves as defenders and spreaders of the faith, establishing a vast network of dioceses, missions, and religious institutions. The Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missions converted millions of indigenous peoples. In Spanish America, the Virgin of Guadalupe, 1531, became a central symbol of Catholic devotion and cultural synthesis between European and native traditions. By the late 17th century, Christianity was the dominant faith in Latin America, with the Church playing a key administrative and cultural role. The Jesuit reductions in Paraguay, founded in the early 1600s, represented one of the most organized missionary efforts in history. The Jesuits created semi-autonomous Christian communities among the Guarani people, combining religious instruction with education, music, and agriculture. These settlements functioned until the mid-18th century, when the suppression of the Jesuits by European monarchies dismantled the system. In Africa, Christianity's presence was limited mainly to coastal trading centers under Portuguese influence, such as Angola and the Congo. Catholic missions had existed in the Congo Kingdom since the late 15th century, but by 1700 the Church's presence was weakened by the slave trade and political instability. In Protestant Europe, the post-Reformation period was marked by theological consolidation and denominational differentiation. Lutheranism remained dominant in Scandinavia and parts of Germany, while Reformed traditions shaped the Netherlands and Switzerland. England's religious landscape continued to evolve after the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. The monarchy's restoration under Charles II in 1660 re-established Anglicanism, but dissenting groups, Puritans, Baptists, Quakers, and Congregationalists, continued to grow, forming the basis of later Protestant denominations. In 1685, Louis XIV of France revoked the Edict of Nantes, outlawing Protestantism and forcing hundreds of thousands of Huguenots to flee. Many resettled in the Netherlands, England, Switzerland, and the American colonies, spreading Reformed thought and skill. Meanwhile, the intellectual climate of Europe shifted. The scientific revolution and Enlightenment transformed how people understood nature, knowledge, and authority. Thinkers such as Descartes, Newton, Locke, and later Voltaire and Diderot questioned traditional religious explanations of the world. The Church, both Catholic and Protestant, faced growing pressure to reconcile faith with reason and new scientific discoveries. In the midst of these intellectual changes, Protestant missions began to emerge as organized efforts. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, SPG, was founded in England in 1701, aiming to minister to colonists and convert indigenous peoples in the British Empire. The Pietist movement, which originated in late 17th century Germany under Philip Jacob Spener, emphasized personal faith, moral living, and missionary zeal. At the University of Halle, August Hermann Frank established one of the first Protestant mission training centers, influencing later global missions. Pietism and the Moravian Church, revitalized under Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, played crucial roles in renewing Protestant spirituality and missionary outreach. The Moravians sent missionaries to the Caribbean, Greenland, North America, and Africa decades before larger Protestant denominations followed suit. Their methods, emphasizing personal conversion, community, and discipline, anticipated later evangelical movements. In North America, Christianity developed alongside colonial expansion. The first English colonies, established in the early 1600s, reflected the religious divisions of England. Puritans in Massachusetts Bay sought to build a godly commonwealth, while Anglicans dominated the southern colonies. Quakers under William Penn founded Pennsylvania in 1681, promoting religious tolerance. By 1700, the North American colonies contained a variety of Christian groups: Anglicans, Congregationalists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Quakers. Religious life was decentralized. Each colony regulated its own affairs, and there was no state church across all colonies. In contrast, in New France, modern Canada, Catholicism remained dominant under the control of the French crown and Jesuit missions. In 1730, the First Great Awakening began in the American colonies, a revival movement that transformed Protestantism. Leaders like Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts and George Whitefield, an Anglican preacher from England, emphasized personal conversion, repentance, and emotional preaching. This movement spread across the colonies and into Britain, energizing Baptists, Methodists, and other evangelical groups. The Methodist movement emerged from within the Church of England in the 1730s under John Wesley and Charles Wesley. Their emphasis on holiness, discipline, and evangelism made Methodism one of the fastest-growing denominations of the 18th century. Although initially a reform movement within Anglicanism, Methodism eventually became an independent church. While Protestant missions were expanding, Catholic missions continued to develop globally. In China, the Jesuits reached their peak influence under the Kangxi Emperor, who valued their scientific contributions. However, the rites controversy, a dispute over whether Chinese converts could continue Confucian rituals honoring ancestors, led to papal prohibitions in 1704 and 1742. This decision alienated Chinese authorities, resulting in the expulsion of most missionaries by the mid-18th century. In India, Catholic missions persisted under Portuguese patronage. The Jesuits established schools, churches, and colleges, notably in Goa and Madurai. Roberto de Nobili's earlier inculturation efforts influenced later missions, but faced resistance from both local elites and church authorities. The Age of Enlightenment in Europe, circa 1680 to 1789, saw the rise of rationalism, deism, and skepticism. Many philosophers rejected revealed religion in favor of natural theology, belief in a creator discerned by reason rather than revelation. Churches responded by reinforcing catechesis and education. The Catholic Church, under Pope Benedict XIV and Clement XIII, sought moderate reform while defending orthodoxy. In Protestant countries, the Enlightenment contributed to latitudinarianism, a tendency toward theological tolerance and reduced emphasis on dogma. This was visible in the Church of England, where many clergy accepted reason as compatible with revelation. Meanwhile, deism gained popularity among intellectuals, including some who would later influence the American Revolution. In 1773, under political pressure from Bourbon monarchs, Pope Clement XIV formally suppressed the Jesuit order. The Jesuits had become too influential in education, politics, and finance for the monarchies of France, Spain, and Portugal to tolerate. Their suppression marked a turning point in Catholic intellectual life, although the order would be restored in 1814. The late 18th century also saw Christianity deeply intertwined with the empire. In the Americas, churches were essential to colonial administration and cultural identity. In Africa and Asia, missionary activity advanced alongside commercial and military expansion. In Europe, monarchies used religion to reinforce legitimacy, but also sought control over ecclesiastical affairs through state influence. Gallicanism in France, Josephinism in Austria, and Febronianism in Germany. By the eve of the French Revolution in 1789, Christianity remained the dominant religious force across Europe and its colonies, but its authority was increasingly questioned. The Enlightenment had undermined the intellectual foundations of traditional faith, and secularism was rising among educated elites. Yet, global Christianity had never been larger or more geographically widespread. Catholicism encompassed Latin America, Southern Europe, and parts of Asia and Africa. Protestantism thrived in Northern Europe, North America, and scattered missions abroad. Within these developments, denominational identities solidified. The Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Anglicans had developed distinct theological systems and church structures. Catholicism remained centralized under the Papacy, though weakened by state interference. Between 1648 and 1789, Christianity transitioned from a European religion divided by reform to a global faith with diverse expressions. It was no longer defined by a single empire or region, but by competing denominations spreading through exploration, trade, and education. The next century would challenge both church and state through revolution, secularization, and the rise of new missionary empires. The 18th and 19th centuries marked one of the most transformative periods in church history. Christianity entered an era defined by intellectual upheaval, political revolutions, industrialization, and global expansion. The Enlightenment, emerging from 17th century scientific and philosophical advances, challenged traditional authority and called for the application of reason to religion, society, and governance. These developments reshaped how both Catholic and Protestant institutions operated and understood their place in a rapidly modernizing world. By the early 1700s, Enlightenment thinkers in France, Britain, and the German states had begun to separate faith from reason. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Hume, and Kant questioned miracles, revelation, and the authority of the clergy. Deism gained ground among intellectuals, promoting belief in a rational creator who did not intervene in human affairs. While Enlightenment ideas undermined clerical influence in Europe, they also led to internal reflection within the Church on science, education, and reform. The Catholic Church continued to hold influence across Southern Europe and Latin America, but faced increasing interference from monarchies. Joseph II of Austria implemented reforms known as Josephinism, limiting papal authority, dissolving monastic orders he considered unproductive, and placing church administration under state supervision. In France, Gallicanism emphasized the independence of the French Church from Rome. Similar state interventions occurred in Spain and Portugal, where regalism curtailed clerical privileges. The suppression of the Jesuit order in 1773 weakened Catholic intellectual leadership. The Jesuits had been central to education, science, and global missions. Their absence left a vacuum that reduced Catholic influence in Enlightenment scholarship. The order's restoration in 1814 by Pope Pius VII came too late to recover their earlier dominance, but they would later reemerge as leading educators and defenders of orthodoxy. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, marked a decisive break between the Church and modern political order. Revolutionary leaders sought to dismantle clerical privilege and the alliance between throne and altar. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy, 1790, made the clergy state employees and required an oath of loyalty to the new regime, dividing the French Church. Thousands of clergy refused the oath, and many were imprisoned or executed. Religious symbols and institutions were attacked, monasteries dissolved, and a secular cult of reason briefly replaced traditional worship. By 1799, Catholicism in France was disorganized and impoverished. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power, he sought to stabilize relations with the Church. The Concordat of 1801 between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII restored Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, but under strict state regulation. This model of limited cooperation between state and church became influential across Europe. During the 19th century, the Catholic Church underwent both restoration and adaptation. Pope Pius IX, 1846 to 1878, confronted the liberal revolutions of 1848 and rising nationalism, which aimed to diminish papal authority. In 1870, Italian unification ended the Papal States, leaving the Pope confined to the Vatican. Pius IX responded by asserting doctrinal authority through the First Vatican Council, 1869 to 1870, which defined papal infallibility when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals. This declaration marked the peak of centralized papal power in theology, though it deepened tensions with secular governments and liberal Catholics. Throughout the century, industrialization and urbanization changed the Church's social role. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 1700s, spread through Europe and North America, displacing populations and creating new social classes. The Church responded through education, charity, and labor reform movements. Catholic social teaching began to address modern economic realities, culminating in Pope Leo XI's encyclical Rerum Novarum, 1891, which articulated the rights of workers, the duties of employers, and the Church's role in social justice. Protestantism followed parallel but diverse paths. The Pietist and evangelical movements of the late 17th and early 18th centuries continued to shape Protestant spirituality, emphasizing conversion, moral living, and missionary activity. Catholic missions, often aligned with French and Portuguese imperial interests, established diocesan structures in the Sahel and Central Africa. Protestant missions were prominent in Southern Africa, East Africa, and parts of West Africa, producing significant indigenous leadership from the late 19th century onward. In the Indian subcontinent, Protestant missions dating from the late 18th century intensified in the 19th century. Missionaries from Britain and the United States established schools and seminaries, translated the Bible into major vernaculars, Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, and founded printing presses. Reform impulses within Indian Christian communities produced indigenous clergy and locally governed churches. Catholic missions, long present since Portuguese arrival in the 16th century, continued via new religious orders active in education and healthcare. The complexity of Indian society, caste structures, regional languages, and political fragmentation led to varied patterns of conversion and retention. By 1910, sizable Christian minorities existed in southern and northeastern India. China drew sustained missionary attention after the series of 19th century treaties that opened ports to foreigners. Protestant missions increased substantially after the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, and the Treaty of Nanking. Missionaries established schools, hospitals, and mission stations in treaty ports in the interior. Jesuit and Franciscan Catholic missions also persisted, though missionary activity provoked periodic nationalist backlash and intermittent persecution. Missionaries engaged in cultural translation, scientific exchange, and education. Among notable figures were Hudson Taylor, who advocated indigenizing mission structures through the China Inland Mission, founded 1865, and a growing number of Chinese Christians who became pastors, teachers, and social reformers by the late 19th century. Japan's initial 19th century contact with Christianity ended in the Tokugawa suppression, but the Meiji Restoration, 1868, reopened the country. Christian missionaries re-entered Japan and established schools and hospitals. Fewer conversions occurred than in China, but Christianity had disproportionate influence in education, social reform, and political modernization. Korea experienced rapid Christian growth from the late 19th century, rooted in Protestant missions and a strong indigenous embrace that led to sustained church growth into the 20th century. The Pacific Islands and Oceania were heavily influenced by British and French missions. The London Missionary Society and Anglican and Catholic missions established churches across Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. Missionary activity reshaped social structures, legal practices, and cultural life. By 1900, large portions of Polynesia and parts of Melanesia had majority Christian populations. Indigenous agency was significant. Local chiefs, converts, and catechists often led the spread of Christianity across archipelagos, adapting doctrine to clan and communal frameworks. Latin America's religious landscape was transformed by earlier Spanish and Portuguese colonial missions. However, in the 19th century, Protestant missions expanded in the Caribbean and the Southern Cone, especially after independence movements loosened Iberian clerical monopolies. Evangelical societies from the United States and Britain established presences in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, focusing on urban centers and immigrant communities. Catholicism, though institutionally tied to conservative political elites in many new republics, remained numerically dominant through an entrenched clerical and parish system. Missionary expansion produced significant institutional outcomes. By the early 20th century, denominational networks had created episcopal structures, presbyteries, and synods in many non-European regions. Indigenous ordination grew. African, Asian, and Oceanic clergy began to staff parishes and lead dioceses. Theological education is increasingly localized, with seminaries and Bible colleges training clergy in vernacular languages. These developments facilitated the transition from mission dependency toward ecclesial autonomy, a trend that accelerated during the 20th century. Missionary work interacted complexly with colonialism. In some contexts, missionaries opposed slavery and advocated local rights. In others, they became intertwined with imperial administrations, complicating Christian reception among indigenous peoples. Medical and educational services offered by missions often created social dependence while also enabling social mobility for converts. Resistance to foreign control, nationalist movements, and local religious resilience generated contested religious landscapes. Conversions were sometimes pragmatic responses to new power structures rather than purely spiritual decisions. Statistical measures indicate dramatic growth. Estimates vary by methodology, but Christianity's global adherence rose substantially during this period. Mission reports, denominational yearbooks, and census data show accelerated conversion rates in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia between 1850 and 1914. Bible translation efforts were extensive. By 1900, substantial portions of Scripture existed in hundreds of languages and dialects, while complete Bibles had been printed in scores of tongues. Missionary societies reported tens of thousands of missionaries and local workers active worldwide by the end of the century. The missionary period also produced intellectual, and institutional challenges. Debates over indigenization, how much local culture and governance the church should adopt, divided missionaries and sending societies. The three self-principles, self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating, articulated later in missionary discourse, had precursors in late 19th century debates over autonomy. Rights controversies, such as the earlier Chinese rights debates, continued to shape Catholic and Protestant policies. Ecclesiological questions about episcopacy, synodality, and the role of laity became practical concerns in newly formed churches. Women functioned centrally in mission work. Female missionaries and religious sisters provided education for girls, nursing care, teacher training, and social services. Their presence altered gender dynamics in mission fields, created new career paths for Western women, and facilitated the emergence of indigenous women leaders in education and social welfare. By 1914, the Church's global shape had changed. Christianity was no longer confined to Europe and the European diaspora. Large and vibrant Christian communities existed across Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. Indigenous clergy and lay leaders were increasingly visible in ecclesial governance. Institutional infrastructures, dioceses, seminaries, hospitals, schools, and print networks enabled sustained religious life independent of immediate foreign control. The entanglement of mission with colonial power, the rise of local agency, the translation movement, and the creation of national churches established the structural foundations for 20th century global Christianity. The period from 1914 to 1945 transformed the global Christian landscape through two world wars, revolutionary upheavals, the rise of totalitarian states, and contested ecclesiastical responses. Churches that had long assumed cultural authority found themselves negotiating unprecedented violence, ideological competition, and mass upheaval. Institutional survival, pastoral care, moral leadership, and political accommodation all shaped Christian institutions' decisions as states mobilized societies for total war and as revolutionary regimes sought to eliminate or control religious influence. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, brought mass mobilization of Christian populations across Europe, colonial subjects, and diaspora communities. Churches provided chaplains, burial rites, hospital care, and pastoral support for soldiers and civilians. Christian leaders interpreted the conflict according to competing theological frameworks. Some treated it as just war or national duty. Others developed explicit pacifist positions. The scale of loss, millions dead and wounded, intensified questions about divine providence, the moral order, and the church's role in public life. Clergy served in the trenches and on the home front. Thousands of parishes faced the loss of a generation of men, affecting congregational continuity and social structures. The war's political aftermath reshaped the institutional context for Christianity. The collapse of four empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, produced new national borders and revived national churches in Eastern Europe. The Russian Revolution of 1917 inaugurated a sustained and often violent conflict between Bolshevik state atheism and organized Christianity. The Soviet regime implemented policies that nationalized church property, outlawed religious instruction, closed seminaries, and persecuted clergy. The Russian Orthodox Church lost the majority of its churches and a large proportion of its clergy in the 1920s and 1930s. Monastic communities were suppressed, and most theological education was dismantled. Similar policies affected Greek Catholic and Orthodox communities in territories absorbed by Soviet power. The Soviet state institutionalized atheism through organizations like the League of the Militant Godless, and by the 1930s, thousands of clergy and believers had been imprisoned, deported, or executed. In Central and Eastern Europe, new nation-states sought to align churches with national politics. Poland re-established a dominant Catholic public culture after 1918. Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states negotiated complex relations between national churches and minority confessions. These arrangements often intensified confessional politics, where church identity and national identity became tightly linked. The interwar decades also produced new forms of Christian engagement with modern politics. Christian social movements and political parties were organized in response to industrialization, social unrest, and the perceived failures of liberal governments. Catholic social teaching, developed from Rerum Novarum and later encyclicals, inspired political movements that would evolve into Christian democratic parties across Europe. Protestant social ethics and lay movements created trade union and welfare initiatives. These developments positioned the churches as major social actors, but they also made them vulnerable to authoritarian co-optation in regimes that sought moral legitimacy. The emergence of totalitarian ideologies, fascism, Nazism, and radical communism posed distinct challenges. In Italy, Mussolini's regime re-established relations with the Catholic Church through the Lateran Accords of 1929, which created the Vatican City-State and granted the Church certain privileges and financial settlement. The Lateran Treaty secured formal recognition and ended a long-standing dispute, enabling the papacy to exercise a clear diplomatic status while also binding it into a concordat relationship with an authoritarian state. In Germany, the Nazi movement sought to reshape German society and minimize competing loyalties. The regime manipulated church-state relations initially through legal arrangements and later through ideological campaigns. In July 1933, the German state and the Holy See concluded the Reichskonkordat, which guaranteed certain rights to the Catholic Church but also committed the Vatican to non-intervention in political affairs. The Concordat did not prevent subsequent Nazi violations of church rights. Within German Protestantism, the German Christian movement attempted to align Protestant churches with Nazi racial and national ideology, while opponents organized the confessing church to resist state interference in doctrine and appointments. The Barmen Declaration of 1934, drafted by theologians including Karl Barth, rejected the subordination of the church to the Führer and affirmed Christ's lordship over the church. Individual Protestant pastors, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, joined resistance networks. Bonhoeffer was arrested in 1943 and executed in 1945. Martin Niemöller, another confessing church leader, spent years in concentration camps. The Roman Catholic response to Nazism and fascism varied by context and level. Papal diplomacy under Pope Pius XI included public condemnations of totalitarian ideologies, most notably the 1937 encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, issued in German, and read from Catholic pulpits in Germany, which criticized Nazi racism and breaches of the Concordat. At the state level, many Catholic bishops attempted to protect their institutions and flocks through concordats and negotiated accommodations, while some clergy and lay Catholics participated in resistance. Others adapted to or supported authoritarian regimes. The subsequent papacy of Pius XII, elected 1939, adopted a policy of official Vatican neutrality during the Second World War, combined with behind-the-scenes diplomacy and relief efforts. Historians continue to debate the adequacy and consequences of papal actions during the Holocaust. Sources show a mix of Vatican humanitarian activity, discreet interventions, and restrictions on public denunciation, with varying national episcopal responses. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, intensified the Church's dilemmas. The Nazi regime's genocidal policies led to the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jews, including many who were culturally Christian or converts from Christian communities, and the targeted killing of Roma-disabled persons' political opponents and large numbers of clergy and laity who resisted or were deemed threats. In occupied territories, the persecution of the Church varied. In Poland, the Nazis executed or imprisoned thousands of priests and closed religious institutions. In the Soviet-occupied Baltic states and Ukraine, the Soviets pursued severe repression of both Catholic and Orthodox institutions. In some countries, local church leaders openly opposed occupation policies and organized relief for Jews and other victims. In other cases, church institutions were constrained by state power or cooperation with national authorities. Missionary networks and overseas churches also suffered disruption. War in the Pacific and Asia led to internment, expulsion, and deaths among missionaries and converts. Japanese occupation policies curtailed Christian institutions in East and Southeast Asia. Colonial administrations used missionary schools to maintain stability, but wartime mobilization and anti-colonial sentiment accelerated pushes for indigenous church leadership. The theological response to these crises included a re-evaluation of Christian doctrines of the state, suffering, and human dignity. Continental theologians such as Karl Barth reacted critically to liberal theology, accommodation to nationalism, and sought a return to scriptural revelation as the center of dogmatic theology. Protestant theologians in Germany and elsewhere grappled with the implications of state idolatry and nationalistic religion. Theologians under oppression explored themes of witness, martyrdom, and the relation between church and totalitarian power. Ecumenical activity continued and adapted. Interwar conversations among Anglicans, Orthodox, and Protestants intensified in the 1920s and 1930s around social relief, missionary coordination, and theological dialogue. Practical cooperation in relief and refugee aid during the 1930s and 1940s foreshadowed stronger post-war ecumenical institutions. Churches participated in humanitarian assistance to refugees and displaced persons, organizing networks that preserved human lives and provided pastoral care. Demographically, the two world wars accelerated shifts in Christian concentration. European Christian populations experienced massive casualties, forced migrations, and border changes that altered confessional geographies, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The devastation of Jewish communities in Europe radically reduced the historical presence of Judeo-Christian cultural intersections. At the same time, Christian populations in the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia continued to grow, setting the stage for the next century's shift of Christianity's demographic center away from Europe. The period 1914 to 1945 left the churches with weakened institutional prestige, but also with renewed questions of social responsibility. Churches that survived authoritarian pressures found themselves buffeted by the moral legacy of accommodation, resistance, and complicity. Clergy and laity faced post-war reckonings concerning wartime behavior, property restitution, and the pastoral care of societies traumatized by violence. The wars and revolutions reconfigured the relationship between religion and politics in ways that would determine the Church's roles across the mid-20th century. The Vatican's diplomatic standing had grown through concordats and treaties. National churches often became instruments of state policy or loci of resistance. And Christian theology had to confront modern ideologies that had aimed either to co-opt or to eradicate religious faith. The aftermath of the Second World War marked a decisive reordering of the global Christian landscape. Between 1945 and 1990, the Church confronted political realignment, decolonization, secularization, and social revolutions. While Europe entered a period of reconstruction and ideological division, Christianity expanded rapidly across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The period reshaped ecclesiastical authority, theological discourse, and the demographic center of the faith. In 1945, the devastation of war left European churches institutionally weakened but still integral to social recovery. Clergy organized relief work, distributed food and clothing, and rebuilt schools and hospitals. Protestant and Catholic aid organizations, such as Caritas Internationalis and the Lutheran World Federation, provided cross-border humanitarian coordination. At the same time, political restructuring forced churches to define their position within the emerging bipolar world order dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War divided Europe not only politically but also religiously. In Eastern Europe, communist governments imposed state atheism, restricted religious practice, and nationalized church property. The Soviet Union reinstated limited legal recognition of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1943 for wartime unity, but strict surveillance continued under the Council for Religious Affairs. The Church operated under heavy censorship and infiltration by state security services. Seminaries reopened under state oversight. Patriarchal leadership maintained cautious cooperation while attempting to preserve liturgical life and limited autonomy. Similar arrangements existed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, where Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant communities operated under varying degrees of repression. Many priests and lay leaders were imprisoned. In some cases, entire church hierarchies were replaced with compliant clergy. The Greek Catholic Uniate Church was outlawed in Ukraine in 1946, and its bishops were deported or executed. In contrast, in Poland, the Catholic Church became a major symbol of national resistance under communist rule, maintaining a broad network of parishes and educational institutions despite constant government interference. In Western Europe and North America, the immediate post-war period saw church attendance remain high through the 1950s, supported by strong social conservatism and family structures. Christian democratic parties gained influence in countries like West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, shaping welfare policies according to Catholic social teaching. Protestant denominations maintained significant public roles through education, moral discourse, and political life. However, the later decades would witness the beginning of secular decline in institutional religion across much of the Western world. One of the most significant developments of the era was the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, convened by Pope John XI and completed under Pope Paul VI. The council sought aggiornamento, updating the Church's engagement with the modern world. It produced major documents that reshaped Catholic theology, liturgy, and ecumenical relations. Sacrosanctum Concilium reformed the liturgy, introducing vernacular languages into the Mass and promoting active lay participation. Lumen Gentium redefined the nature of the Church, emphasizing the people of God and collegiality among bishops. De Verbum renewed biblical scholarship by affirming the importance of historical critical methods, and Gaudium et Spes addressed the Church's role in modern society, including social justice and human rights. The Council also initiated new dialogue with non-Catholic Christians, Unitatis Redintegratio, and other religions, Nostra Aetate, acknowledging the spiritual value of Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. The Council transformed Catholic identity, reducing clerical distance from laity, expanding lay ministries, and encouraging adaptation to local cultures. Implementation varied across regions, producing both enthusiasm and resistance. Conservative and traditionalist groups criticized what they viewed as doctrinal compromise or loss of reverence. Simultaneously, Protestantism underwent its own structural and theological transformations. The ecumenical movement matured, culminating in the founding of the World Council of Churches, WCC, in 1948 in Amsterdam. This organization united Orthodox, Anglican, and Protestant bodies for cooperative mission, social witness, and theological discussion. It coordinated global responses to war, poverty, and racism, while maintaining autonomy for each member church. The Lambeth Conferences of the Anglican Communion continued to shape interprovincial relations and address social issues such as family planning, peace, and global inequality. Lutheran, Reformed, and Methodist unions advanced in Europe and Africa, promoting a unified Protestant witness. However, the Cold War political context complicated ecumenical relations with churches under communist regimes, where Western affiliations were viewed with suspicion. Decolonization transformed global Christianity. Between 1945 and 1975, dozens of new nations emerged in Africa and Asia, each negotiating the legacy of missionary Christianity and colonial administration. Indigenous clergy and church leaders assumed authority, translating Christian theology into local cultural frameworks. In sub-Saharan Africa, independent churches proliferated, often blending Christian doctrine with African social and spiritual traditions. The African Independent Church movement, including groups such as the Aladura in Nigeria and Zionist churches in South Africa, demonstrated local agency in adapting Christianity beyond missionary control. Catholic and Protestant missions expanded education and healthcare networks, while local hierarchies gained independence. By the 1970s, Africa's Christian population had surpassed 100 million, with growth accelerating across the continent. In Asia, the Church navigated complex political environments. In China, the communist victory in 1949 led to the expulsion of most foreign missionaries and the creation of state-controlled religious associations. The Three Self-Patriotic Movement for Protestants and the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association for Catholics, separating them from external ecclesiastical authority. Underground house churches persisted despite repression. In India, Christianity remained a minority faith but maintained influence through schools and social services. In Korea, post-war division and the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, produced differing church trajectories. In the South, Protestantism expanded rapidly through evangelism and revivalism, while in the North, Christianity was virtually eliminated under state atheism. The Philippines, the region's most predominantly Christian nation, saw steady Catholic growth and the rise of Protestant and independent churches. Latin America experienced major religious and political shifts. Catholicism remained the dominant faith, but the social inequalities of the region prompted new theological reflection. The Second Vatican Council inspired the Medellin Conference of Latin American Bishops in 1968, which applied conciliar principles to social justice, poverty, and development. This meeting marked the emergence of liberation theology, a movement emphasizing the Church's role in advocating for the oppressed and addressing structural injustice. Thinkers such as Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff argued for interpreting the gospel through the lens of social liberation. The movement gained influence among clergy and laity, but drew criticism from the Vatican for its perceived association with Marxist analysis. The Papacy under John Paul II later moderated the movement, encouraging social action within doctrinal boundaries. In the United States, post-war prosperity and cultural stability supported high church membership through the 1950s. The election of John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president, in 1960 symbolized Catholic integration into mainstream political life. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s involved extensive Christian participation. Black Protestant churches, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., combined theological conviction with political activism, shaping public perception of faith and justice. Meanwhile, the evangelical revival of the 1960s and 1970s, fueled by figures like Billy Graham, reinforced personal conversion and mass evangelism. Pentecostalism spread rapidly, emphasizing spiritual gifts and dynamic worship, influencing both Protestant and Catholic charismatic renewal movements worldwide. The 1960s also brought new challenges. Secularization advanced across Europe, driven by urbanization, education, and cultural liberalization. Church attendance and vocations declined sharply in traditionally Catholic nations such as France, the Netherlands, and Spain, and in Protestant Northern Europe. Debates over contraception, clerical celibacy, and women's roles in ministry widened internal divisions. The cultural revolutions of the late 1960s and 1970s questioned traditional authority, altering moral teaching on sexuality, family, and public ethics. In response, the Vatican reaffirmed doctrinal positions, particularly in Humanae Vitae, 1968, which prohibited artificial contraception. Protestant denominations adopted diverse positions, with some liberalizing marriage and ordination policies. Orthodox Christianity also experienced revival and repression. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, churches operated under state control until the gradual liberalization of the late 1980s. The Russian Orthodox Church, despite restrictions, maintained national significance, preserving liturgical tradition and serving as a cultural anchor. The Greek Orthodox Church stabilized after wartime upheaval and continued theological dialogue with Western Christianity through participation in ecumenical forums. Throughout this period, Christianity's global demographic balance shifted decisively. In 1900, roughly 80% of Christians lived in Europe and North America. By 1980, less than 60% did. The number of Christians in Africa and Asia increased fivefold between 1950 and 1990. The Bible had been translated into more than 1,800 languages by the late 20th century, and Christian education expanded through new seminaries and universities. Global organizations such as the World Evangelical Fellowship, founded in 1951, and the World Methodist Council strengthened transnational cooperation. In Eastern Europe, persistent resistance movements linked Christianity with national identity. In Poland, the Solidarity movement emerged in 1980 under the protection of the Catholic Church, combining labor activism with moral authority. The election of Pope John Paul II in 1978, the first Polish pope, became a catalyst for opposition to communist control. His visits to Poland mobilized millions and weakened state legitimacy. In Latin America, dictatorships faced opposition from clergy who defended human rights and denounced torture and disappearances. Notably, Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, assassinated in 1980 while celebrating Massachusetts. By the 1980s, the Church confronted a global pluralism unprecedented in its history. Theological trends diversified. Feminist theology, contextual theologies in Africa and Asia, and renewed interest in patristic sources emerged. Evangelical and Pentecostal movements grew explosively across the global South. In the Soviet bloc, declining ideological control foreshadowed the religious revival that would follow the collapse of communism. Between 1945 and 1990, Christianity adapted to decolonization, ideological conflict, and cultural transformation. Institutional forms shifted from European dominance to decentralized, multilingual, and multicultural expressions. Church leaders, theologians, and lay believers negotiated the tension between modernity and tradition, producing the foundations of the contemporary global church that would define the decades to follow. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a new era in world Christianity. The end of the Cold War removed ideological restrictions that had confined religious life for decades, allowing churches in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics to re-emerge publicly. Simultaneously, global communication, migration, and cultural interconnection reshaped religious identity and influence. The Christian faith entered the 21st century with over 2 billion adherents, its demographic center having shifted decisively toward Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In Eastern Europe and Russia, the early 1990s saw the legal restoration of churches and properties confiscated by communist regimes. The Russian Orthodox Church rapidly regained prominence, supported by the new Russian state. Cathedral restorations, the reopening of monasteries, and the ordination of thousands of clergy re-established its institutional presence. Under Patriarch Alexei II and later Patriarch Kirill, the Church positioned itself as a central moral and cultural authority, promoting traditional values and national identity. The revival included the reintroduction of religious education and cooperation with government policy, though this alignment sometimes generated criticism for limiting religious pluralism and civil liberty. In Ukraine, the church question became intertwined with politics, with multiple jurisdictions, Orthodox under Moscow, Orthodox of Kiev, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, competing for legitimacy. In Western Europe, secularization deepened. Church attendance declined across nearly all denominations, and public policy increasingly separated from religious influence. Legalization of abortion, same-sex marriage, and assisted dying in various countries illustrated a cultural transition toward individual autonomy and plural moral frameworks. Catholic and Protestant institutions faced aging congregations, financial challenges, and priest shortages. theological discourse shifted toward managing institutional contraction, preserving heritage, and redefining mission in post-Christian societies. Despite numerical decline, churches maintained influence in humanitarian work, refugee support, and education. Cathedrals and historic churches continued to function as cultural landmarks even when congregations dwindled. In contrast, Christianity's expansion in the global South accelerated. In Africa, the number of Christians grew from roughly 140 million in 1970 to over 650 million by the early 2020s. Pentecostal and charismatic churches accounted for much of this increase, emphasizing direct spiritual experience, healing, and prosperity teachings. Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo became centers of theological and ecclesial innovation. Indigenous leadership replaced foreign mission structures, and African preachers gained international recognition. The Catholic Church expanded seminaries and dioceses, while independent Pentecostal and evangelical networks built megachurches and media ministries with global reach. However, rapid growth also brought challenges: doctrinal fragmentation, prosperity theology controversies, and governance issues. In Latin America, the religious landscape changed profoundly. Catholicism, long dominant, experienced competition from Pentecostal and evangelical churches. Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, and Honduras witnessed major Protestant expansion from the 1980s onward. These movements appealed to urban populations through emotional worship, community support, and emphasis on personal conversion. The Catholic Church responded with renewed pastoral initiatives, emphasizing small Christian communities and social outreach. Liberation theology persisted but adapted to avoid Marxist frameworks, focusing instead on community development and human dignity. Under Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, the Vatican balanced social engagement with doctrinal orthodoxy. By the 21st century, Pentecostalism accounted for more than 20% of Latin America's population, reshaping political and cultural life. In Asia, the Church continued to grow despite diverse political environments. The Chinese Church experienced rapid underground expansion despite state control. The Three Self-Patriotic Movement and the Catholic Patriotic Association remained the only legally recognized bodies, yet unregistered house churches, both Protestant and Catholic, flourished. Estimates of China's Christian population rose from about 10 million in 1979 to over 70 million by the 2010s, though accurate figures remain uncertain. Government policy oscillated between tolerance and repression, especially under President Xi Jinping's administration, which sought tighter ideological control through sinicization of religion. In South Korea, Christianity became the largest religion, characterized by strong evangelical and Presbyterian traditions. Seoul emerged as a hub of global missions, with Korean churches sending thousands of missionaries abroad. In India, Christians remained a small minority but continued to make significant contributions to education and healthcare. However, the rise of Hindu nationalism increased tensions, leading to legal and social restrictions in some regions. The Philippines remained the most predominantly Christian nation in Asia, combining Catholicism with a vibrant Protestant presence. The post-1990 era also saw a profound transformation within the Catholic Church. John Paul II, 1978 to 2005, became one of the most influential popes in modern history. His papacy emphasized moral conservatism, opposition to communism, and global evangelization. His 104 pastoral visits made the papacy a visible global presence. He addressed youth through World Youth Day, promoted interfaith dialogue, and strengthened relations with Judaism and Eastern Orthodoxy. His role in supporting democratic movements in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, linked the Church with political transformation. His successor, Benedict XVI, 2005 to 2013, prioritized doctrinal clarity and liturgical continuity, resisting relativism and defending traditional teachings. He faced internal challenges, declining vocations, sexual abuse scandals, and financial corruption within the Vatican. His resignation in 2013, the first papal abdication in nearly 6 centuries, marked a historical turning point. The election of Pope Francis in 2013 introduced a pastoral and reform-oriented direction. As the first pope from Latin America, he emphasized humility, social justice, and environmental responsibility. His encyclical Laudato Si, 2015, addressed climate change as a moral issue, linking ecology and poverty. Francis focused on decentralization, synodality, and inclusion, engaging contemporary issues such as migration, inequality, and sexuality. His approach drew both support and opposition, praised for compassion and criticized by traditionalists for perceived ambiguity. He also advanced relations with Islam through meetings with global Muslim leaders and with Orthodoxy through renewed dialogue with the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. The Orthodox churches navigated complex national realities after communism's collapse. The Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople sought to maintain pan-Orthodox unity, but jurisdictional disputes deepened, particularly between the Moscow Patriarchate and the newly recognized Orthodox Church of Ukraine, granted autocephaly in 2019. Political and theological divisions mirrored geopolitical rivalries. In Greece, Serbia, and Romania, Orthodox churches retained strong cultural positions. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, centuries-old Christian communities declined due to emigration and conflict. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and the Syrian civil war severely reduced ancient churches such as the Assyrian, Chaldean, and Syriac communities. In the Protestant world, denominational realignments and ideological polarization defined the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Mainline Protestant churches in Europe and North America continued numerical decline and internal division over sexuality, gender roles, and scriptural authority. Many congregations split or merged in response to these disputes. In contrast, evangelicalism and Pentecostalism expanded rapidly. Non-denominational megachurches attracted millions through contemporary worship and digital outreach. The Global South became a center of Protestant vitality. African and Asian churches began sending missionaries to Europe and North America, reversing historical patterns. The sexual abuse crisis within Catholic and Protestant institutions emerged as one of the most significant challenges to global Christian credibility. From the 1990s onward, widespread revelations of clerical abuse and cover-ups caused deep institutional trauma, lawsuits, and loss of public trust. The Vatican introduced reforms on accountability and victim protection, but the consequences extended across denominations. These scandals exposed systemic failures in governance and pastoral oversight, prompting renewed calls for transparency. Digital communication transformed Christian practice. The internet, social media, and streaming platforms enabled global access to sermons, liturgies, and religious education. During the COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 to 2022, online worship became standard, forcing churches to adapt to virtual sacraments, remote community, and financial disruption. The pandemic accelerated existing trends of declining physical attendance in some regions and innovative digital evangelism in others. The crisis also revived theological discussions about suffering, mortality, and public health ethics. Migration and globalization reshaped Christian demographics within the Western world. African, Asian, and Latin American immigrants revitalized declining European congregations, introducing multilingual worship and cultural diversity. In the United States, Christianity remained influential but increasingly fragmented. Evangelical movements engaged politics, while secularism and religious nones expanded. The Southern Baptist Convention, once the largest Protestant denomination, experienced internal decline due to generational change and social polarization. Simultaneously, Pentecostal, Hispanic, and immigrant churches grew, reflecting the pluralistic future of American Christianity. The 21st century also saw renewed interfaith dialogue. The Vatican, World Council of Churches, and numerous evangelical networks promoted cooperation on humanitarian issues such as poverty, peace-building, and climate action. Relations between Christianity and Islam fluctuated, marked by both cooperation and conflict. Terrorism, refugee crises, and geopolitical tensions influenced perception, but collaborative initiatives between Christian and Muslim leaders sought to promote coexistence. Theologically, the era emphasized contextual reflection. African theologians developed approaches integrating traditional cosmology with Christian doctrine. Asian theologians explored dialogue with Buddhism and Hinduism. Feminist, ecological, and liberation theologies diversified academic discourse. Across traditions, emphasis on social ethics, justice, and inclusivity grew. However, debates over gender, sexuality, and authority continued to divide communities. By the early 2020s, global Christianity encompassed vast diversity. Catholics numbered over 1.3 billion. Protestants and evangelicals combined surpassed 900 million. Orthodox Christians accounted for around 260 million. The fastest growth occurred in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, while Europe's share of global Christians fell below 25%. The demographic shift influenced theology, leadership, and cultural expression. African and Asian cardinals gained greater presence in the Catholic hierarchy. Protestant and Pentecostal networks headquartered in Lagos, Seoul, and Sao Paulo held international influence. Humanitarian engagement became a major dimension of modern Christian identity. Churches operated hospitals, schools, and relief agencies across developing regions. Organizations such as World Vision, Caritas Internationalis, and the Salvation Army coordinated responses to disasters and conflicts. Environmental stewardship emerged as a shared moral concern, linking theology with sustainability. The global refugee crisis and rising inequality intensified calls for faith-based advocacy. Despite internal divisions and cultural challenges, Christianity remained the world's largest religion, present in every nation and language group. Its institutional forms are diversified, from traditional cathedrals to digital congregations and grassroots movements. Post-1990 history revealed a faith negotiating modernity through adaptation rather than uniformity. The contemporary church operates as a global network of intersecting traditions, each rooted in its context yet linked by historical continuity with the apostolic foundations of the first century.